Test, 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 1, 2, 3.
All right, good afternoon. Can everybody hear me? Okay. Welcome to the panel on agency. In this panel, we hope that the participants would consider this perilous category, which names a kind of being and doing not available to the enslaved and the descendants of the enslaved, but which has defined the ways Black will and beingness has been written about and theorized. We hoped to consider together how the current political moment, one wherein renewed efforts to curtail Black political expression and Black social life operate alongside insurgent expressions of resistant Black art and scholarship, informs our understanding of what agency may look like and does not look like, what agency can and cannot do in the face of state violence. So I'd like to introduce our panelists in order, and I'm going to introduce them this time in reverse order, so from your right to your left. Adrian Davis is Vice Provost and the William M. Van Cleave Professor of Law at Washington University. She also holds courtesy appointments in history, women, gender and sexuality studies, and African and African American studies. Her work has been published in the Stanford Law Review, Columbia Law Review, and California Law Review. Professor Davis's teaching focuses on what she calls the law of daily life, including contracts, property, and trusts and estates. Professor Davis has been the recipient of a Bellagio Fellowship from the Rockefeller Foundation and 2 research grants from the Ford Foundation on such topics as Black women and labor and women, slavery, sexuality, and religion. Professor Davis earned her BA and JD from Yale University, where she served on the executive committee of the Yale Law Review. Alex, I asked Wahelier. No. Alex Wahelier. I'm doing my best. I have no ear. He is a professor of African American Studies at Northwestern University. He's the author of Phonographies, Groove and Sonic Afro-Modernity, which was awarded the Modern Language Association's William Scarborough Prize for Outstanding Scholarly Study of Black American Literature or Culture, and Habeas Viscus, Racializing Assemblages, Biopolitics, and Black Feminist Theories of the Human. His work has been published in American Literary History, The Black Scholar, Boundary 2, CR, The New Centennial Review, the Journal of Visual Culture, Public Culture, Small Acts, Social Texts, and the Anthologies of Black Europe and the African Diaspora, among others. Ronaldo Walcott is an associate professor at the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education at the University of Toronto and the director of Women and Gender Studies Institute, as well as a member of the graduate program in Cinema Studies of Faculty of Arts and Science, University of Toronto. His teaching and research is in the area of Black diaspora cultural studies and postcolonial studies with an emphasis on questions of sexuality, gender, nation, citizenship, and multiculturalism. Professor Walcott is the author of Black Like Who, Writing Black Canada, with a second revised, which was published in 1997 with a second revised edition in 2003, and Queer Returns, Essays on Multiculturalism, Diaspora, and Black Studies. He's also the editor of Rude, Contemporary Black Canadian Cultural Criticism. He co-edited with Roy Moodley, Counseling Across and Beyond Cultures, exploring the work of Clement Vontress in clinical practice. Currently, Dr. Walcott is completing The Long Emancipation, Moving Towards Freedom, and is the general editor of Topia, the Journal of Canadian Cultural Studies. And Yarima Bonilla is Associate Professor of Anthropology and Caribbean Studies at Rutgers University. Her book, Non-Sovereign Futures, examines the examines the political possibilities that emerge in the wake of post-colonial disenchantment through an ethnographic study of labor activism in the French Caribbean island of Guadeloupe. And her recent comments on Puerto Rico for NPR and the Washington Post are crucial interventions in the media coverage and non-coverage of the crisis in Puerto Rico. Please help me in welcoming this panel.
This is it. Okay. Now is this better? All right. Good. We're good. Oprah doesn't have these problems, I note. She's a professional. It was often the case, quote here for Saidiya, it was often the case that benevolent correctives and declarations of slave humanity intensified the brutal exercise of power upon the captive body rather than ameliorating the chattel condition. With this deceptively simple pronouncement, Saidiya inaugurated a new moment in agency as an acute problem in slavery studies. Deftly breaking through the stark historic standoffs over slave agency, begun by Elkins and Tannenbaum, and powerfully answered by Blassingame, she renders a needed corrective, a complex, nuanced vision of how agency too could exist but still serve the logic and need of slavery. She paints the thick lines of varying, quote, spatial fields of domination, notably those in which slaves stealing away amounted to thefts of themselves, and in which their efforts at pleasure or leisure reinforced pastoral visions of the slave relationship, one rooted in dependency and affection. I would like today to consider a different set of enslaved practices, excuse me, not stealing away or dissembling or self-mutilating, but instead when slaves sought to enter and navigate a different field of spatial domination, contract. Contract, of course, is that field of law most defined by its aspiration to liberal bourgeois norms of individual betterment through negotiation, toil, and faith. Faith in the other and faith in democratic capitalism. Henry Maine famously announced the modern age as a movement from status to contract, and that individuals were no longer bound to spend their lives in the station in which they were born, but could instead envision and mobilize a different life through a series of micro and macro transactions with others. While many things can be the basis for enforcement, it is the exchange of labor that defines the field of contract. The slave, of course, is the ever-laboring object. Yet slavery and contract were, of course, antithetical, and acutely so. As Saidiya says, the bourgeois individual, the unencumbered self, and the featureless person that give meaning to the term political in its conventional usage, with all the attendant assumptions about the relation of the subject and the state, cannot incorporate the enslaved. For how does one express an individual will when one is without individual rights? After all, the rights of the self-possessed individual and the set of property relations that define liberty depend upon, if not require, the Black as will-less and actant and sublime object. If white independence, freedom, and equality were purchased with slave labor, then what possibilities or opportunities exist for the Black captive vessel of white ideality? Close quote. And yet, if slaves stole away, dissembled, danced, and self-mutilated in ways that did not always conform to the desires of the masters and the needs of the slaveholding state, other slaves challenged the spatial configuration of dominance, not through movement, but by staying put, but doing so as liberal contracting subjects. I take 3 examples. Like many enslaved people, Sani found himself auctioned at an executor's sale, sold to pay his deceased master's debts. At the sale, Sani bargained with his new master to repay his purchase price in exchange for his future freedom. While the court stated that proof of this alleged contract was not clear, it found that Sani had given his master a wagon and 3 horses, plus wages he had earned from extra work done beyond that work compelled by his master. Although it appears that Sani performed his end of the deal, and indeed, following classic contract law, it is difficult to explain Sani's actions in the absence of a contract, his master refused to emancipate him. Sani sued in equity, asking the court to enforce the contract and to grant his freedom. The court refused, finding that equitable pleas for freedom were limited to cases in which the plaintiff had a legal title to freedom, but confronted some technical obstacle, such as a fraudulently suppressed will or a flawed deed that someone had not signed. Not only did state statutes limit manumission to slaves who would perform meritorious service, like saving the master's dog, but it was also illegal for masters to permit slaves to go at large and hire themselves out, as Sani had done to earn the money to pay his master the wages, the wagon, and the 3 horses. Despite his masters voluntarily entering the deal, and despite Sani's performance of his end of it, the court refused to enforce their agreement, leaving Sani enslaved to Carter, and Carter with 3 horses, a wagon, and extra money. In Waddell versus Martin, an executor sought to be reimbursed by the estate for giving slaves money from cotton they had grown and processed through their master's own contract with the cotton gin. The master then kept a cut of the money, the proceeds. Judge Ruffin, the infamous author of State versus Man, upheld the arrangement, finding the slave's cotton to be only a, quote, petty and little production, analogous to the agricultural production of white wives. The slaves received what today's money would be $4,400, and the executor was reimbursed by the estate for the fees. Finally, in Talbert versus Jenny, Jenny's master promised her that after she gave birth to 5 children, so that each of his own children could enslave one of hers, he would free her. In 1792, Mr. Talbert gave the deed to Jenny and her son Moses to his own son Charles Talbert as collateral for a loan from his son, confirming the understanding that the deed was only collateral and not a transfer. Jenny and her family remained with Talbert Sr. Later, the Talbert family did indeed divide up Jenny's children, with the understanding that Jenny had fulfilled her end of the bargain and that she and her 6th child were now free. Shortly thereafter, the Talbert patriarch did emancipate Jenny and her 6th son, Lorenzo. Jenny subsequently had 2 more children who, along with Lorenzo, lived with her as free Black people. This situation continued until after Talbert Sr.'s death, with Jenny's first 5 children divided amongst the adult Talbert children and her last 3 children living with her as free Blacks until 1813, when the son, Charles Talbert, seized Jenny's 3 youngest children, claiming them as his property by virtue of the deed his father had given him in 1792. Jenny, he apparently had no interest in re-enslaving. Jenny sued to enforce Talbert Sr.'s promise, the freedom of her last 3 children. Unlike in Sani versus Carter, in Talbert, the court upheld the manumission petition. It declared that Jenny's children were free based on a series of technicalities regarding whether the 1792 deed to Charles had been canceled, and also, importantly, a determination about the equities of the Talbert children's behavior towards their father. The court made much of potentially fraudulent conveyances among the family to shelter assets, and also of grave concern to the judges was an apparent family secret that Charles knew and was threatening to expose. Hence, much of the court's concern appeared to be the equities of the Talbert children's behavior towards each other and their father. It did not, however, enforce the manumission based on Jenny's contract with her master or on the equities of her master's behavior towards her. Contracting subjects did not subvert the field of spatial domination of slavery by stealing away. Rather, they acquiesced to it, and unlike their fellow dancing slaves, Contracting slaves sought to bring the field down on its own terms. Yet, as Saidiya notes, these fields of power were vast and deep, with unpredictable peaks and devastating valleys. Jenny could win, of course, because her claim to freedom was based on a contract to continue to reproduce slavery, reinforcing the essence of a logic that claimed economic rights in enslaved women's reproduction. Her arrangement fits squarely within what I have called slavery's sexual political economy, a field in which enslaved women's reproductive relations were economic ones and their intimate bonds were political ones. And the slaves in Waddell versus Martin, although serious entrepreneurial agents, they too operated within the system, using their leisure time to produce more cotton, of which their master took a cut. Indeed, the arrangement exemplifies the outer logic of slavery, the limit of slavery in which the master cannot compel more labor and imports capitalism to extract additional labor from what was slave leisure time. Their arrangement was indeed mutually beneficial within the logic of slavery, but as demonstrated by the ease with which Judge Ruffin could minimize the value of what the slaves were producing, it did not undercut the logic of slavery. It was only Sawney, presenting himself as a liberal subject, with a residuum of labor, seeking to construct himself as a wage laborer negotiating on his own contract, who sought to actually disrupt the system of slavery. Sawney also disrupted what Saidiya calls the pastoral, the field in which slavery can be cast as the relations of benign dependency and affection, without a present mediating state that Sawney's insistence on a contract for his wagons would bring. Sawney was the most threatening subject, as his claim was not the claim for the contract of freedom itself, but his claim to be a contracting subject could bring the entire system down. Slavery could include room for manumissions, but contracting subjects were anathema to the system. The contracting enslaved subject claims a sort of fixity to the very bourgeois landscape that is producing slavery and is disrupting it in a different sort of way. In the end, and here I quote Saidiya, liberty defined by not only, as Saidiya says, inalienable rights of property, but also by contract was theft. Thank you.
Can everybody hear me? Good afternoon. First of all, thank you to Marisa, Maisha, Lisa, and Carter for making this possible. And of course, also, the mic is not on, or I'm not speaking into it. Is this better? Okay. I feel like I'm climbing inside of it. Anyway, so what I'm going to present today is a reverberation of and on scenes of subjection. And it is primarily a continuation of a conversation that I had with Saidiya about global blackness and the relationship between Black studies and African studies. And it also responds to the prompts that the organizers gave us. So it's called Castigated Agency. Given what we call agency is always already curtailed as a general rule, but of course more so within the context of Black life, qua the afterlife of enslavement, I don't think these current practices necessarily require, these are the practices mentioned in the prompt, require recalibrating scenes consideration of agency. Hartman uses numerous compounds to describe this conundrum over the course of the text. Coerced agency, simulated content, the double bind of agency, castigated agency, and constrained agency, among many others. And among many of its epochal accomplishments, and perhaps one less discussed dimension of scenes of subjection now, the text represents an extended rumination on the clipped coordinates of agency during enslavement and after. As I said, today I want to dwell on castigated agency, quasi-fabulate about it in the contemporary moment. And I begin with the dictionary definition of castigated. A, to criticize or reprimand severely, to punish in order to correct, and it is derived from Latin castigus, to correct, set right, purify, chastise, and punish. Overall, the force that animates this word is to make someone pure by correcting or reproving them, end quote. Since Black life and culture continue to be criminalized within the modern order of things, the granting of agency to Black folks still often has, if not almost always, corrective dimensions, as both castigatingly subjecting and castigatingly subjectivating. As Hartman writes, and I quote, "The enduring legacy of slavery was readily discernible in the travestied liberation, castigated agency, and blameworthiness of the free individual," end quote. As such, delinquency supplies the shaky ground upon which the edifice of being free and Black is built. Let me give you a concrete current example. As part of various anti-terror initiatives in the wake of September 11th, 2001, the Department of Homeland Security launched a program called Countering Violent Extremism in 2015, which has as its goal to fund local organizations in order to stave off youth radicalization, especially in Muslim communities. More recently, the Trump administration has suggested to substitute the original name for either countering Islamic extremism or countering radical Islamic extremism, and to, for instance, no longer include white supremacist groups who are nominally included in these initiatives, who have carried out terrorist acts in the United States. Overall, the motto seems to be, why pretend when you can keep it all the way real, and not, make any of those things. Besides law enforcement agencies and the University of San Diego, which distributes the monies to local organizations, the largest CVE grant, Countering Violent Extremism, has gone to an organization, Heartland Democracy, that works primarily with the large Somali population in Minneapolis, and which is not only a Muslim, but also an almost exclusively Black community, constituted primarily by refugees from the Somali civil war and their families. And what I'm leaving out of this, and what I hope to discuss in the larger project, is of course that the community constituted itself through refugees in terms of the U.S. military's covert and overt operations in Somalia since the late 1970s, which contributed to the displacement of millions of people, but also contributed to what is now known as the rise of Islamism in Somalia. But I'm going to leave that out of the picture for today. It has been the tendency of the CVE and other anti-terrorist initiatives to single out Black Muslims, whether U.S. or foreign-born, for increased surveillance, policing, and criminalization, even though they constitute the minority within within the overall U.S. Muslim population. And according to a recent study, 20% of U.S. Muslims are Black, while only 6% are foreign-born. Meaning that the Somali community in Minneapolis would be part of that 6%. And also, despite the recent racialization of Islam as Arab and South Asian in the United States. As opposed to direct policing and surveillance measures, the CVE was designed to facilitate the agency of young Muslim men through after-school programs, for instance, by offering them the opportunity to choose to not become engulfed by radicalization, for instance, through the joining of violent extremist groups such as Al-Qaeda, Al-Shabaab, or ISIS. That is, the after-school programs funded by the CVE in Minneapolis and other U.S. and Northern American cities operate under the assumption of the innate criminality exhibited by young Somali men. It should come as no surprise that Somali women are not in this picture, and this is also something that I want to think about more, but they also fall outside of the helpless Muslim woman in need of rescue by the West because they are too Black, too ungendered, too queer. This too is the afterlife of slavery as a gendered regime, to quote Sarah Haley from earlier. And the only agency available comes in the form of castigation. which allows for the voluntary slash agentive turning away from radicalization as ontological criminality, an imaginary corrective purification in the service of white supremacy in which the outcome is always already predetermined. The Minneapolis-based Building Community Resilience pilot program initiated in 2005 intensified pre-existing outreach programs and solicited input from members of the local community so as to create a bridge between law enforcement and the Somali population there. And this whole project falls under the purview of what Simone Brown calls racializing surveillance, which she defines as enactments of surveillance that reify boundaries along racial lines, thereby reifying race, and where the outcome of this is often discriminatory and violent. The creation of the Black Muslim, aka Somali terrorist, as an internal threat to national security, as well as the use of CVE initiatives for law enforcement to infiltrate, gather intelligence about, and police young men in the Minneapolis Somali community, fortify other direct forms of state and state-sanctioned violence against this already vulnerable population. Also, another part of this would be to think about the countries chosen for the travel ban by the Trump administration, and how majority Black countries are overrepresented on the list of Islamic countries. In addition, the programs funded by the CVE draw on existing anti-radicalization ideas, which are both inspired by and direct continuations of anti-gang initiatives used to police other Black American communities that reinforce the criminalization of both Black folks in general and Somalis in particular, in the context of the Minneapolis community. In the process of directly mapping urban gang activity onto putative terrorist radicalization, Somali Muslims become ensnared in existing infrastructures of law and order policing that criminalize Black communities in the US and in Canada. And there's similar things in Canada. And I was also thinking about this in relationship to what my esteemed colleague, Professor Walcott, talked about, the blackening of the Somali community in Toronto in the early 1990s, right, where we see a similar process happening here in this context. The methods and ideas deployed by the CVE also extend FBI programs like COINTELPRO and its excessive surveillance, the FBI's of Black Muslims in the Nation of Islam, for instance, that we heard about briefly earlier. The specter of the radical Somali terrorists, steeped in longstanding notions of Black criminality, forms the basis for domestic counterterrorism ideology and policymaking. And if we are to believe Professor Hartman, and clearly we should, and I quote, that doesn't mean agree, just FYI, but of course that happens most of the time too. So the majority of the violence committed against the freed in the aftermath of slavery was incited by charges of unbecoming conduct, which included one's dress, demeanor, movement through public space, tone of voice, and companions, end quote. In other words, the post-emancipation violence resulted from the mere existence of Black folks. Though clearly these more recent endeavors are not the same, my point is that in the worldview promulgated by the CVE, as well as other anti-terror discourses and institutions, the mere presence of Somalis as Muslim and Black in Minneapolis and in other spaces renders their very being and existence as unbecoming conduct, thus engendering both direct and indirect forms of state violence. And I'm also thinking about what Simone Brown said in her comments to the questions, the end of the last panel, and the example that she gave of Black identity extremists, right? That is also another way in which simply being Black and being critical is unbecoming conduct and therefore criminal. And also the other example in the film Naz and Malik, where the quasi-public intimacy of the two queer public intimacy of the two protagonists is the cause for the surveillance and the policing. Consequently, agency becomes available only through castigation, corrective purification. How am I doing on time? I'm not keeping. 3 minutes? Okay. So let me just jump ahead a tiny bit. In the wake of these CVE-funded initiatives, young Somalis in Minneapolis have formed two important groups, the Young Muslim Collective and the Anti-CVE Campaign, to counteract the excessive surveillance, policing, and criminalization of the community there. Both groups work to resist CVE ideology by publicly speaking out against local existing CVE-funded initiatives and very clearly refuse funding from the CVE themselves because they don't believe that the community work can actually be done through the auspices of the CVE. And have also, despite not having funding, offered alternative services such as youth mentoring programs, writing workshops, and a community mental health survey. So let me just move towards the end here. This is responding, a longer response to whether we should, to one of the prompts, what is the political value of thinking of Black protest, resistance, and joy and pleasure in terms of agency? And I do want to quote Saidiya one more time here when she says the exploration of agency and resistance is less concerned with issues of heroic action and oppositional consciousness than with the inadvertent, contingent, and submerged forms of contestation, end quote. And overall, among many wishes that I have, I really wish that we would finally lay to rest the troubling dichotomy between oppression and resistance, since both exist in each other's orbits in that they are co-constitutive but are never reducible to each other. And this, to me, thinking about scenes of subjection, particularly through the lens of agency, is something that became clear to me much more palpably than it already had been before, right? That the two always coexist in this kind of fraught space. In particular, the idea that merely mentioning Black pleasure, joy, culture, et cetera, and so on is always tantamount to a quest to show that that the mere existence of Black pleasure and joy signifies the abolition of anti-Black oppressive forces, and conversely, the tendency to elide the oppressive structures when investigating and honoring Black cultural achievements and Black pleasure and Black joy. While the Somali youth organizations represent a clear and direct result of CVE-funded surveillance, policing, and criminalization, viewing them as merely a byproduct of the CVE would miss the point, because they are always more and different than a simple response. They highlight both the possibility and existence of alternate ways of being. Similarly, because we were asked about hashtags and I couldn't resist, the open grid, the pound sign that introduces and magically transforms a conglomerate of words into technological hashtags like Black Lives Matter or Black Girl Magic makes something else possible beyond the immediately given. Thank you.
Okay, so yeah, can you hear me? Okay. I want to thank the organizers for the wonderful invitation to speak here, and I want to in particular thank the administrative staff for getting me here. There are books and essays that after encounters with them, you approach the world, not just scholarship, differently. For me, Hazel Carby's Reconstructing Womanhood, Paul Gilroy's The Black Atlantic, Dion Brand's The Map to the Door of No Return, and Saidiya Hartman's Scenes of Subjection, the book that we celebrate today, have done that for me. You assimilate these books into your regiment of thinking like they have always been a part of your own logics, and thus you own them in ways that surprise you on further and continued encounter with them. Such is the case with Hartman's Scenes for me. In what follows, I hope you might hear the tremendous debt I owe to Scenes and the other works I've mentioned, but particularly Scenes. Recently, the public, and my talk is really a riff off of the prompt that we were given. Recently, the public archive tweeted, and I quote, "Someone needs to explain to me how we went from Burn, Hollywood Burn to Oscars So White in less than a generation." You have asked us to consider questions of hashtag Black political assertion like Black Lives Matter, Say Her Name, Black Girl Magic, Black Boy Joy, and Oscars So White, while making a reconsideration of Hartman's engagement with agency at this moment of Black politics. I have often found myself tweeting, "Live your contradictions," as a way to grapple with claims of Black political assertion that make demands on the state, its institutions, and its authorizing mechanisms. For me, "Live your contradictions" is one way of critiquing moments like Oscar's So White, which are suffused with a demand for inclusion and participation in the stultifying and indeed death dealing capitalism of Hollywood. On the one hand, Black people, as former and still products of capital and capitalism, remain wedded to an idea that we too can share in it as a project of justice and restitution for a brutal past of bodily theft, psychological terror, and ongoing devaluation of our differently marked human lives. Indeed, the demand for a justice based in participating in capital, like Oscar's So White, cannot be maintained in the face of the other hashtags. Thus, for me, Black Lives Matter and Say Her Name bear a marked difference to the other hashtags like Black Girl Magic and Black Boy Joy, and yet still different from Oscar's So White. The difference in each hashtag has something to do with the underlying desires for their invocation. What sits outside capital, what desires to be inside capital, what resists and desires to destroy capital is crucial for me. And indeed, what is conditioned by the violence of capital's invention is central here. Thus, for me, Black Lives Matter and Say Her Name are of a different order of desirous being. We live in a moment where Black human life remains an ongoing question for those who are not Black. Hashtags like Black Boy Joy and Black Girl Magic can take from the whimsy to the fantastic of Black life to make a public case for just living, living just enough, or living large. But these hashtags also bring something along with them, and that something else is a certain suspension of critique, a kind of collective nod of Black celebration that quickly moves from the banal, sometimes surprising, to an easy, unquestioned acceptance of Black people's uncritical participation in capital. Here I think of all the Twitter stories of young Black people as entrepreneurs, bakers, designers, etc. Child labor celebrated as the brutal capitalist calculus of Black survival. Indeed, what sometimes gets posed under these monikers is anything but magic and joy, and instead celebrations of access to the crumbs of imperial capital. Again, participation in the edges of capital becomes a celebration of Black life, but for me it is a kind of perversity in which capital is still devouring Blackness. Of course, hashtags Black Lives Matter and Say Her Name mark something different for me. Those two hashtags have a certain quality to them that require we encounter something more profound about our present and past human order. Those hashtags ask that we consider the desires, fears, pleasures, joys, wants, needs, among a range of other qualities of what I have come to call, in my work, the Black life form. Those two hashtags mark the ongoing question of how Black lives might be valued in the midst of imperial capitalism and its historically profound anti Black racist foundation and formation. For some, those two hashtags might be invoked with desires for capital attending them, but any real reckoning with them will turn one to the scene of the original crime: bodily theft, land theft, genocide and near genocide, primitive accumulation, capitalism, and so on. But those two hashtags also turn our attention to, borrow from Sylvia Winter, the genres of the human: woman, man, boy, girl, trans, persons with disability, and on, requiring us to think them again and differently, and further yet to think about how some forms of life might achieve full lives, which, in my view, means grappling with how capital organizes all of planetary life. It therefore bears making clear that conversations about a potential Black agency are always hampered and overburdened by racial capital and the historical and contemporary place of Black people inside capitalism. That capital is itself a violent invention of Blackness troubles how agency, a term so deeply wedded to capitalist critique, can be mobilized to make sense of Black people's desires for autonomy, bodily and otherwise. Hartman, in her work with and work around agency, often brings her readers to questions of labor, vagrancy, idleness. All these come to the fore. At the site of labor agency, At the site of labor agency, we meet a certain kind of critical limit for Black peoples given our dual role as a laboring commodity. But more importantly, agency to resist the terms of a stalled emancipation becomes more crucial. C.L.R. James in the 1940s ties lynching to forms of agency and labor control, arguing that, for example, when cotton was booming, lynching decreased, and when the economy became difficult for poor whites, lynching was left unchecked. He further pointed out that most lynchings occurred where a black labor force was no longer needed. That's something that we might call black agency to self-determinate in terms of a labor market remained and still remains deeply limited. And by the way, despite the vaunted success of Lee Daniels, Ava DuVernay, Ryan Coogler, the same is so for Hollywood. That is, their labor is limited by a perceived need for it or not. It is a kind of modern sharecropping, regardless of what pleasures we might think we derive from it. In my own work, I have turned to thinking again the problem of emancipation as central to the conditions of action that we might call agency. I have argued that post-emancipation acts of Black life have been consistently interdicted by preempting and often violently preventing Black life from authorizing its own desires for bodily autonomy. Stuck in the process of fully breaking from the logics of slavery and plantation economy, Black people have found themselves in the long emancipation. The long emancipation does not simply suggest that Black people are still enslaved, but rather that Black people are continually prohibited and interdicted from being capable of authorizing what exactly freedom might look like and mean for them collectively. Indeed, such conditions mean that asserting the notion of agency for Black people, one rooted in the critique of capital, remains barely possible. And yet, this is not to say that Black people might not engage in acts of what we might cautiously call agency. As Hartman has noted in the US context concerning emancipation, quote, the vision of former masters and former slaves as equal members of the national community incited a wave of reaction registered in the opposition to the 13th Amendment, the imposition of the Black Codes, and the pervasiveness of racist terror, end quote. The Anglo-Caribbean preceded the US with that same formation, and the Lusophone and the Spanish Caribbean followed after the US, with similar interdictions, marking the limits of the juridical and legislative emancipation, all with practices meant to interdict Black agency or acts of practice, as I'm going to call them, or what we might call Black freedom. Finally, in Hartman's work, agency is often attached to volition and will. And it is the latter two that might offer us a way to think about Black acts of practice that point to a potential Black agency. Here I think of sagging pants and their ethics. This is an example that I have continually used because it unfolds all the problems of capital, Black bodily autonomy, and the ways in which the state intervenes in multiple ways to interdict small acts of Black freedom or even the assertion of its possibility. City ordinances banning sagging pants point to the ways in which acts of practice acts of practice that suggest bodily autonomy and thus a potential Black freedom are interdicted in an attempt to curtail such acts of freedom. The Black codes, vagrancy laws, and notions of Black idleness are all historically related to their contemporary sagging pants and previously ball cap wearing ordinances. Black people's volition and will to attain some measure of control over our bodies is an affront to a deeply imagined logic in which Black people are not supposed to own our bodies. And we see this playing out with the kneel in football as well. Because sagging pants resist a certain kind of capitalization is often outlawed. In my work, I argue that the sagging pants ethics then is an attempt to keep alive forms of Black resistance and acts of practice that animate Black life beyond capital, not just in opposition to it. These acts of practice, in which Black people attempt to self authorize their own modes of being in the world, are always at some point violently apprehended. Nonetheless, such an ethics, as I insist on calling it, announces to a capitalist world, I know you mean me no good. And it forces a confrontation with all of the forces arrayed against Black personhood. All those forces which seek to take even the meager elements of the sustenance of life away from us, and even still, which seek to take the command of our own bodies from us too, still insisting that racial capital and the laboring commodity remains our fate, even as Black lives now drift into wasted lives. And yet, as Black people, reanimate those same lives intramurally with acts of practice still awaiting. And yet, Black people reanimate those lives intramurally with acts of practice still awaiting invention. For what is Black life if not constant, unceasing invention? Thank you. No, I know.
Hello, is this on?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry. I'm trying to keep my voice. I normally have a very little voice, and so when it goes away, it's a real problem. Um, well, so first of all, I want to say that it's a real pleasure to be here. I feel like my bookshelf has come to life, and that's very surreal and exciting. However, I have to say it was really interesting to me the comments yesterday when people were talking about scenes, particularly Professor Morton, as scenes as this kind of Bible that have come back to repeatedly and repeatedly, and how it was a book that so solidly shaped their training. For me, as someone trained solidly in the social sciences, Scenes of Subjection wasn't a canonical text. In fact, it was a text that I felt like was a secret text that only I knew about, because certainly none of my professors in anthropology at the University of Chicago were talking about it, especially after Trio was gone. As I was finishing my book, it was one of the key texts that helped me really think about the entwined problems of freedom and sovereignty in the Caribbean and the double-edged sword of each. So I'm very grateful to Saidiya for that. When I heard that Marisa and Carter were putting together this conference, I actually begged them to let me participate in one way or another. So I was really excited to be a part of it. But I have to admit that I audibly groaned when I saw that I was assigned to a panel titled Agency. um, the reason for this is that within anthropology and sociology, fields in which I am forced to traffic, conversations around agency have and sadly continue to be defined by precisely the kind of work that Saidiya and our panelists are writing against. Around the same time that scenes came out, anthropology was busy producing and canonizing one of its now classics, In Search of Respect, Selling Crack in El Barrio. Is anyone familiar with this? Right. The text is about why Puerto Ricans in the inner city are motivated to sell drugs. The answer being that it is a way to satisfy their culturally motivated desire for respect within the otherwise dehumanizing context of the projects. The book came out in 1995, but it is still taught regularly in classes, particularly in introduction to anthropology classes, including by some of my colleagues here at Rutgers. Shade. It drives me crazy that for the thousands of students who pass through these classes, often students who are not majoring in anthropology, they might be business majors or taking an easy elective, right? This might be the only grotesque example they might have of something resembling Latino studies. It is problematic for those who will come to know Latinos solely through this type of text, as well as for those for whom this text will be the sole representation they will find of themselves during their academic career. Now, when I harass my colleagues, as I repeatedly do, not just behind their backs, about why they continue to teach this text, they will constantly tell me that it's great for thinking about structure and agency. They'll also say things like, it teaches well, or students like it. Some friends have even sent me comments from their students in order to show how engaged their students were with the text, as if those student evaluations and that the way in which the book makes sense to their uninformed logics in any way negated my critique. Now, In Search of Respect came out 20 years ago, but we still see texts that replicate this model of agency, most recently Alice Goffman's On the Run. And I want to thank Christina Sharp. I don't know where you're. Thank you, Christina, for your amazing takedown of On the Run in New Inquiry. Thank you. In the previous session, Herman Bennett was signaling how important it is that we do not leave history to the historians. I similarly want to thank scholars like Christina for not leaving sociology to the social scientists. Now, thankfully, Goffman has come under great scrutiny, but books like these continue to be cited, celebrated, awarded, and taught rather uncritically, partly because it has been only scholars of color that have critiqued their work. And as Herman pointed out, other scholars might cite alternative works, but their work continues without really showing any assimilation of the critiques of these traditions. So some of the folks that who have heard my constant critique of these types of books, they seem to think that part of why I and others critique these texts is because of a kind of politics of respectability, where we don't want scholars to think about Latinos in the urban city. So the kind of idea of, oh, let's talk about Latino millionaires instead. Let's talk about Lin-Manuel Miranda, as if he wasn't equally problematic. Indeed, there are ways in which we can imagine both the representations of the Jibaro crack dealer and the staging of a Puerto Rican Hamilton as scenes of subjection.
Mm-hmm.
I appreciate that. Thank you. There is a reason that these two forms of Latino visibility garner attention. As Saidiya taught us, it is precisely criminality and festive spectacle which operate as overdetermined sites of agency. Now, of course, my initial groan at my assignment was unwarranted. Saidiya's work and that of the panelists here are precisely the necessary correctives for the trope of agency that we find in the savage thought of anthropology and most urban studies. What we find here among these scholars is a discussion of agency as entangled within oppressive narratives of capitalism, patriarchy, and empire. What we see here is the dark side of agency, its castigations, punishments, and cruel rewards. For example, Alex directs us specifically to push back on the idea of agency and oppression as a binary, arguing that this is not a matter of an either or, but rather of a complex entanglement. Adrian asks, what does it mean to challenge one system of oppression with the tools and logics of another? What does it mean to challenge slavery through the tools of capitalism? And we could extend these questions. What would it mean to challenge capitalism through the tools of patriarchy, for example? Reynaldo asks how hashtag campaigns like Oscar So White challenge or not the logics of capital, how they are in themselves uncritical participations in these systems. And he asks us, and this was a sentence that really resonated with me, if we should celebrate access to the crumbs of imperial capital. All of these papers, to my mind, help us think about how our desires for freedom are conditioned by the very conditions of our enslavement and our subjugation. In Scenes of Subjection, Saidiya asks, what possibilities for agency exist that don't put the enslaved at risk of a greater order of pain and punishment, since the slave is a legal person only insofar as he is criminal and a violated body in needs of limited forms of protection? I've been thinking a lot about this in the context of responses to the recent hurricanes that have swept through the Caribbean. Among the many things we've seen during this time has been a repeated insistence on asserting the U.S. citizenship of Puerto Ricans and Virgin Islanders. There is so much that is problematic here. Firstly, it ignores the secondary citizenship of racialized subjects in the U.S. and how Puerto Ricans and U.S. Virgin Islanders are part of a larger archipelago of neglect that connects them to New Orleans, to Ferguson, and to Flint. It fails to recognize that citizenship will not save you and that legal personhood depends on exclusions and denials. In addition, it replicates the disavows of narratives like those of the Dreamers that castigate and criminalize the unauthorized. rather than recognizing how we are all the illegitimate children of empire. Lastly, this insistence on the citizenship of the territories is also an insistence on belonging to the United States as property. It is an effort to be recognized as subjects and objects of empire. We thus shouldn't be surprised that claims like this are met by being hurled paper towels in order to clean up our own mess. I actually don't have anything else to say.
You don't have to say anything else.
I'll just open up for questions. Yeah, just open up for questions.
Thank y'all so much for this, for these great provocations. Ronaldo, I have a question about the reading of Black Girl Magic and Black Boy Joy as sort of uncritical participations in capital. You use very strong language to kind of dissent from those projects. And I'm wondering about that. I'm wondering if you would say more about it. I find so black girl look, black girls are magic, right? And I think we should say that every time we can. But I also find that Black Boy Joy is an attempt to disrupt, if not sort of modes of capital, certainly modes of toxic masculinity that don't allow Black men and boys to laugh in the public sphere, right? And to express joy without having whatever version of masculinity they perform being challenged as in some way perverse or unacceptable. And so I'm just, so it struck me as odd, because what are the spaces where we can then, have joy or celebrate that we are making it, or celebrate that these systems aren't killing us? Do we have to give primacy in our analysis to the hashtags that, like, do we have to be radical and woke at every moment, right? Just real talk. Or is there a moment to let your hair down and say, like, I'm listening to this ratchet whatever, I'm dancing to it, I took a video, I put it on Twitter, Instagram, and that too matters in a context where you're not supposed to have any joy. So I wonder about that. Thank you.
Thank you for the question, and it allows me to clarify and kind of both push back. So a couple of things. One is I think in the first instances of both Black Boy Joy and Black Girl Magic, that there were attempts to try to undo certain kinds of popular hegemonic notions of Black girls and Black boys. But I think that they very quickly slip into a kind of collective groupthink. And one of the ways in which I mark that is, and I know I'll get into trouble for this, but I don't mind getting into trouble, is, Black Girl Magic very quickly extends into the anti-discourse around politics, so Maxine Waters are anti, and, we're getting our time back. And that's, meanwhile, what that does is it unwrites a much longer historical and political project that she's been involved in terms of empire. But also what I see happening is this kind of broader, kind of collective groupthink in which there's no kind of critical conversation about what exactly is being celebrated. And that for me is troubling. And it's troubling because I want a radical politics that's about undoing capital. I want a radical politics that's about a particular kind of Black self-authorizing that can be about something more than capital. And I would argue that Black people have done that. Black people have done that in the interiorities of their homes. They've done that in other Black community formations, where we've been able to imagine or interiorize and to play them out and to live them with joy and pleasure outside of this particular kind of spectacle that the hashtag moment now instantiates for us. So for me, both black girl magic and black boy joy have fallen into a very strange and for me perverse conundrum, which is that those moments really pop up when we are noticed by white supremacist structures. Those moments really pop up when we seem to be inside capital. And the irony is that black people are always inside capital, either as its commodity or as its problem. So to celebrate when we notice ourselves inside of it is a particular kind of political trouble for me.
Um,
Um, let me add a few things. I mean, I think the issue that I would have with what you were just saying, Ronaldo, is that the celebration of pleasure and joy always has to have some kind of goal and explicit politics. But that's what you just said. That's what you want. You did not?
Mm-mm. I said that's what those hashtags do.
Okay. In any case,
Were he to say that, what would you respond?
what I wanted to say is that I think this is going perhaps in a slightly different direction, and where the problem for me comes with particularly the joy and magic hashtags is that at a certain point there's a particular image that's associated with what Black joy is, and it looks strikingly the same across all these different terrains. And I think it's a very, very, and a number of people have pointed this out, that it's generally a very sort of class-based, middle-class aesthetic, right? That then happens. It's not exclusively so, but you don't think so?
no, I don't. I in fact don't think that black girl magic or black boy joy are middle class at all. In fact, I think that this, like, look, this conversation is the when I think about who is talking about black girl magic, that's everything from black girls celebrating their weave, it's like folks talking about, eyebrows on fleek. That's deeply working class and very southern. And in fact, it rejects the sort of notion that the only way that you get to have magic is because you can go to brunch, right? Or because you can go to, Martha's Vineyard or whatever. Those aren't the people tweeting about black girl magic. It's like real everyday working class folks who are overrepresented on social media who are using those hashtags. So they are from the belly of the beast talking about what does it look like when I hustled and nobody wanted me to make it, but I'm still out here, not because I've made it and I'm part of the 1%, but literally because like I figured out how to pay the rent or I figured out how to feed my baby, right? And so I want somebody to come celebrate with me that every day something has tried to kill me, right? And it didn't win, right? So this feels like the critique in this moment and the illegibility of the joy and the magic feels like the place where I'm hearing the sort of classism, not the folks who are asserting a celebration of what it looks like to try to make it in these systems where they don't have access to this kind of language. And I'm not saying that like I'm trying to resist the urge to like I hate it when folks are like, "All you elitist academics." I don't believe that because I'm also here as an academic, so that is not the nature of my critique. But this is but in this very particular moment, this feels like a real misreading of what seems to be happening on these hashtags.
That's
I
not what I
agree.
was saying.
Yeah.
Just to
Sure, got
clarify,
it.
I wasn't
Sure, got
talking
it.
about the participants. I was talking about particularly a certain kind of aesthetic that, in relationship to black masculine folks, that sort of imagines the only way of carefreeness or joy of having flowers in one's hair. That the aesthetic tends to get narrower and narrower as it becomes more as it becomes more popular. I wouldn't disagree with anything that you said, and I don't think that that's necessarily about the participants, but what becomes sort of the goal of it, right? What is supposed to be celebrated, and that was my only that was my only.
Can I very quickly respond? I actually would contest a lot of what you're saying, Brittany. And the reason why I would contest it is because I think that, again, the ways in which we have come to interpret what gets posed under those hashtags is similar to a moment in Black studies where the South and the working class gets vaunted as the kind of purest form of blackness. And so what I would say, let me finish. Just let me finish. So I'm pointing to a set of logics and practices of interpretation that actually mask something else going on. And we have done that in Black studies a lot. So we talk about, like, there's all of this work around the blues, around hip hop, that's really supposed to be about talking about working class people and disenfranchisement in post-industrial America. But actually what we're talking about is a set of aesthetic and political desires and practices that are about middle class instantiation of ruling working class, of how to be the middle, the go-between for working class Black people. And I see a lot of that happening through these hashtags. So the very people that we sometimes claim that we are celebrating through those hashtags are actually the people that we need to keep in the hood.
I don't want to hijack this conversation, but
Yeah.
I saw the thing that you did even in your paper where you talked about Maxine Waters, right, as this person who is sort of engaged in an imperialist project. And I do want to say that there's a problem because I am a Southern woman and I'm from a small town in the deep South and I work up north. And I frequently tell people that I'm unimpressed with Northern Negroes. And it feels important to say that really explicitly in this moment because I actually think that there's a real dishonesty in the way this conversation happens, right? That either you have that there is that in Northern cosmopolitan spaces, there becomes this conversation about how the South dominates the conversation too much and about how Southern working classness is trying to overstep. And so then what you get is sort of like Northern Black folks, right, or cosmopolitan, or like we say in the country where I'm from, cityfied Black folks, right, doing this, making these sorts of claims about the ways in which they can't access authenticity. And I don't, being here and looking at the ways that these centers dominate academic discourse tells me all I need to know about the ways in which the South actually is not a driver of this conversation. And I think what we should do is put on the table that all of us have anxieties about the demands for a certain kind of authentic performance or connection to hoods or connections to communities, but it's not fair to sort of and I do see the Southernness in it because I'm Southern, and I think that illegibility does happen up north, and I don't think we have to impose that as a kind of authenticity, but I also don't think that the North gets to claim the sort of space of, cosmopolitanism or, the last thing to then say is I think it's actually deeply problematic to just sort of throw in Maxine Waters as sort of a denizen of like moving imperial projects along with there's anytime you say Black women are sort of engaged in the U.S. in an imperial project rather than that they're in the belly of the beast being dissenters to those projects and you don't give them, then there's something deeply problematic about that. And I recognize it wasn't the point of your paper, but also that we're actually, if I'm in a room, we're not going to sit up north and talk about how it's problematic for the South to sort of have some kind of space because there is a way in which Northern academic spaces also dominate conversations that the rest of the world is then tagged into in terms of these conversations. The South, you don't have these kind of conversations too much in the South because what schools are you going to have it at, right? So let's put it all on the table. It's not that I don't hear you. It's just that that's not all that there is to the story.
Thanks. I'm going to take another question.
Hi, these were extraordinary presentations. Thank you all very much. My question actually situates itself inside of at least a piece of the conversation that we've just had, but tries to also put Adrian's paper and Professor Walcott's paper in conversation, because I was struck as you were talking about these three cases, Adrian, by the ways in which contract law can be understood, and not just for slaves, the slaves you were talking about, not just as a scene of subjection, but as a scene of subjectification. And there's a particular kind of subjectification that goes on because, as you said, the subject of contract law, the person Pat Williams likes to call the arm's length transactor, right, is an individual, and specifically a possessive individual within the terms of C.B. Macpherson's work. And yet there's a kind of performative contradiction in this appeal to a regime of law whose subject is the possessive individual by an individual or a subject whose individualism is always and only possessed, right, under conditions of slavery. And so it connects to what Professor Scott was saying about capitalism and the imperative to see a capitalism which devours blackness and black capital in particular as a violent invention of blackness. And so it prompts me to ask, what kind of agency is possible which lives and breathes and moves solely within the ideological arc of an individualism? In my notes from your talk, I was struck by how much the subject, the black subject you talk about, is a collective subject. So your formulations were it doesn't mean we are enslaved, but denied the right to decide what black freedom would look like for us. You talk about black people attempting to authorize the terms of our existence in this world, command of our own bodies. And yet it seems to me that ideologically, one of the most vexing and dense aspects of the conversation in contemporary Black America, by which I mean the US, is precisely about the ways in which Black freedom can be, or ought to be framed principally in terms of an individuality, right? Or in terms of a collective subjectivity. And so the question I would put to you is how we should think about this question of agency in relation to subjectivity and the competing cases that are made from different ideological and political camps. And this is undoubtedly not a debate that's limited to the US in terms of individualism versus a communitarian, for lack of a better term, collective subject. Who has this mic?
Kendall, thank you for that. One of my, is this on? Yeah. Excuse me. One of my mentors and inspirations there. Yeah, I think that's what you're absolutely right. And part of what I'm trying to get at is how, we oftentimes think of slavery as an opposition to capitalism. And part of what I'm trying to suggest is that slavery was fully capable of incorporating capitalist norms where it was convenient to the logic of slavery, right? So it's yet another spatial field of domination within slavery that I think Saidiya is gesturing towards. And I think you're exactly right that even in these cases where each of these, Sani loses, of course, he's going to lose. He can't, you can't go off and have a contract to become free. But even in these other cases where the individual slaves, individual Black people arguably win, Jenny wins her freedom. These other slaves are able to go on and, have their additional cotton and get some additional money on the side. That even though contract enables the individual betterment, it does not enable the betterment of the group, the collective, right? So in another paper, I have a framing where I try to ask the question whether the assertion of individual rights ends up also being anti-slavery and anti-racist, right? So in these cases, you can find some of these cases where individual slaves may be entrepreneurial enough within the system in the field of law to get access to something that might look like rights or might look like legal cognition of some sort as legal subjects, but it is rarely ever anti-slavery. It's rarely ever anti-racist, and it's rarely ever anti-capitalist. It ends up reiterating those systems. So when Jenny gets her freedom, it's because the state is saying, sure, if Black women want to have contracts to have lots and lots of babies, and then when they're too old, we'll free them. That seems like a pretty good deal for the logic of slavery, right? Absolutely. And if slaves want to, on their free time, produce more cotton and process it through the master and not go out into the market themselves. This doesn't seem disruptive at all. So I guess part of what I'm arguing for is stepping back from the focus narrowly on rights, but instead focusing on within a broader framework of anti-racism, anti-slavery, and perhaps anti-capitalism, depending on where your politics are. So thank you for that question.
Yeah, I'm interested in the Black collective experience, and what I mean by that is I'm interested in the ways in which Black people collectively attempt to authorize how to imagine worlds where they might be able to live full lives. So in terms of thinking through these questions, I'm working out of that Black Marxist tradition, deeply influenced by C.L.R. James, as you see. I went to him at one point. And I'm interested in the ways in which, as I said, the violent invention of blackness is an outcome of capitalism, part an outcome of capital. And so to think blackness inside and always of capital is part of the fundamental conceptual problem that we have when we want to talk about Black agency. So that's why I was using that little phrase, acts of practice, right? So what are the kinds of acts of practice that people have engaged in collectively to resist and to try to live lives and to experience the interiority beyond the realm of capital? And I would argue that those things have happened in the intimacies of our homes, and in other forms, kinds of community formations, where notions of what might be joy and pleasure that are not immediately capitalized, or things that we can do for our body that are not immediately capitalized, are examples of that. But I think, look, one of the things that we can trace from plantation economy right up to the present is the adaptability of the ways in which capital's elasticity to both contain us and make us examples and representatives of. We see this from the kind of examples Adrian just gave us, right up to the last 8 years of Obama in your White House here, right? Or we even see it in the place that I come from, in small so-called island nations, where putatively they're Black led nations, but their embeddedness into a certain kind of global capitalism and routinization of race does not actually produce a freedom for the people who call themselves citizens there. And so these are the kinds of things that I'm trying to grapple with as I kind of try to think through, okay, what's this appeal that some Black people have who think that we can share in capital as a way for restitution and freedom and liberation? That's why I say we're still in the long emancipation, because we've not been able to authorize what that freedom might look like for ourselves.
Thank you guys so much for your panel. I have a question for Dr. Walcott. So you spoke about Black joy in kind of private spaces and like the interiorities of our home, and how in our community and in our social networking, we have access to joy without the systems of capital. But I was curious about the way that knowledge is produced, like how we see the way that we interact amongst ourselves in times of joy, or in like outbursts of joy, and even community development. How does that impact the way that we know ourselves and identify ourselves in those spaces? And then also kind of counterproductive to the capital, if you will. So we all know that, in Black and brown spaces, joy is possible. Joy is something that we experience. However, when you put it under the lens of capitalistic gain, it becomes this minstrel episode of like the happy gay slave, right? So I'm curious about how you can argue these ideas of liberation and joy in private and public spaces, but also give autonomy to the character of the community.
I'm not sure I fully understand, to be honest, what you're asking of me. But what I'm trying to get at when I talk about, I'm not trying to produce spaces of Black experience and joy and pleasure and fear. What I'm trying to get at are, what are the kinds of human qualities that Black people have, and how do we experience them outside of other spaces in which we are marked as non-human? Like, our humanness is not in question to us, right? Our humanness is in question for other people. right? And so the ways in which some of our contemporary, because I work on the present, the ways in which some of our contemporary turns have been, it's been an attempt to demonstrate to others our own humanness. And that for me, whenever we do that, it becomes capitalized. And if it can't be capitalized, it's interdicted and violently apprehended.
This is just a quick follow-up to what you've just said. I'm very curious about hear more about what we're searching for in an outside, right, or in an outside of capital, or because thank you for using the C word, for bringing capital into the conversation. I'm really excited about that. But also about private, you know, and because those are two words that I want to use, but then get questioning about what actually happens with them. So if you could say a bit more about those two.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like I'm taking it first time. The question was for you.
Before, I'm sorry,
Okay.
just 1 second. Before you answer,
Yeah.
can we take one more question?
Cool.
Savannah?
This may take us a little bit in the opposite direction, but I just wanted to attend for one more moment to these kind of lines of inquiry that Brittany opened up, thinking about the relation between the open grid of the hashtag, right, and what it does to the collection of words. And then, Brittany, what you were saying about specifically eyebrows and weave as being kind of these markers of Black girl magic, and how self-fashioning is so gendered, right? And so how this open grid, but then allows self-fashioning that's only always gendered, right? And how it actually kind of, even in search of respect, right? It's supposed to be respect as a Puerto Rican man, right? So it's saying something about how agency is always only, even if we remake and remake and remake gender, is Black agency perennially gendered, or what are space, and what does that mean to work with that, against it, and how does that also relate to our ability to undermine capital with our self-fashioning?
You can, I think that is enough.
Okay, Jana, look, it seems important to me to think capital at the same time that we think something called agency. And it seems important to me to do that because of, Fred and other people aren't here. This question of the Black personhood becoming this laboring commodity, right? The thing that is both sold but must produce capital, which whether it's cotton, sugar cane, what have you. But we also see the discontinuous process of that in our present moment, right? So even when we talk about hashtags, right, we are actually on Twitter, we actually produce Twitter, right? Or joy or pleasure or hashtag is actually the product of Twitter, right? So Black Twitter is actually producing, is a laboring commodity. We are laboring commodities. I tweet a lot. I am a laboring commodity in that sense. So the question then is, for me, and this, Savannah, I think I'm going to try to bridge these two. What are the moments in which there's a glimpse, at least a glimpse, of some notion of bodily autonomy? And I use the sagging pants moment, but I would say, for instance, I can give a different moment. Whenever Black people move, there's an attempt at bodily autonomy. And we know from emancipation to the present, whenever Black people move, they're violently interdicted. We can talk about crossing the Black Mediterranean, in the Anglo-Caribbean where I come from. As soon as emancipation was announced in 1834 and Black people walked off those plantations, what did they do? They brought in similarly vagrancy laws, but they also brought in the indentured, which circumscribed the space that people could move. Right? So movement, this is why carding, stop and frisk, all these kinds of things on streets are particular forms across that black people globally experience, because when black people move, something about the possibility of freedom comes into play, and it has to be violently interdicted. That's what I'm getting at. It's that it is indeed that contradiction around how we might understand what freedom is. And because of these violent interdictions, we are yet to have black people be able to collectively say what freedom looks like and means for them. Because at every time that it's asserted, it's interdicted, it's violently apprehended. And so that's the basis of the point that I want to make. And capital often functions as a kind of seduction of freedom, but it's not freedom.
Just to respond briefly to Savannah's question, I think that's what I was trying to say earlier, particularly with the carefree black boy thing, that it starts as gendered, right? But then there's a particular kind of aesthetic that gets positioned against sort of a normative black masculinity, but it can't veer too much in the direction of actually leaving masculinity and femininity behind, right? It can sort of be slightly femme, but not too much, because then it would actually sort of threaten what a lot of times the hashtags are doing. And maybe I don't disagree with you as much as I think I do, because I do think oftentimes when these hashtags or other things sort of gain a certain kind of currency, it just becomes narrower and narrower, right? And that is really kind of, and I don't ever want to take any black person's joy away from them or acknowledge it or anything like that. But I do think that there is also a question of how far can those things go, particularly in terms of gender. And I would also ask that about, the sagging pants. Like, in what sense do they undermine traditional notions of masculinity, but also at some point begin to reinstate it, right? What is possible within Black Girl Magic and Black Boy Joy that is not in some way beholden to, at the very least, being adjacent to sort of traditional dimorphic gender norms, right? And it's not like other hashtags don't exist, but they don't gain the same kind of visibility and currency. So thank you.
Do you have a question? Okay, we're going to take just two more because ultimately, yes. I see him. Ultimately, we are over time, so we want to start the next panel on time so that we can get to also Saidiya's closing remarks. I think we're all eager to hear them. Pardon? Okay. Well then, we could just stay here all night then. I'm going to just do an intervention, and I'm going to just give it to Fred first.
An intervention to give it to
It's
Fred.
not even it's just more like a modest, based on something that Professor Walcott just said, that the desire, which I think I share, although maybe it's just something that I used to share, but the fact that I don't share it anymore makes me feel bad. But the desire to detach capitalism from freedom immediately made me remember that Milton Friedman wrote a book called Capitalism and Freedom. So my modest proposal is to think about some collective class we might all engage in that hopefully Saidiya would teach. And it would be a reading of Capitalism and Freedom in conjunction with the reading of Capitalism and Slavery, by Williams. C.L.R. James's student who didn't become his teacher, right? Because I just don't know if capitalism can be detached from freedom. Just like we know that Saidiya has been teaching us that freedom can't be detached from slavery. That there's a unit there. There's an ensemble or an assemblage that and these things might not be detachable from one another. But I don't know. But I'm just thinking that maybe this is an extension of the project that we all are involved in, and that we might take some pains to name collectively for ourselves and others, in which it would require, among other things, a really serious, vigorous, brutal, vicious, murderous reading of a text like Friedman, within the context of our own project, not because we care about what he says, but because we want to see what happens if we rip it to shreds, and if we rip the very conceptual fabric that he depends on to shreds.
So I think it's on, right? It's on?
Yeah.
I think I agree with you. I also am very skeptical about whether capitalism and freedom can be disaggregated because of the historical conditions. And I thought about saying this in response to the young lady's question here. But I've been thinking a lot about this, these two relations of domination, contract and marriage, and putting them together with race, with sort of contemporary marginalized Black women's subject bodies in both sex work and in Black polygamy, domestic Black polygamy. So you find obviously in sex work, but not all, but many sex workers, people who conceptualize themselves as sex workers as opposed to being prostituted, typically turn to the language of liberal capitalism to try to carve out a space of agency, and they experience all of the things I think that Saidiya just beautifully recounts. They claim pleasure, and we can't tell whether the pleasure is sincere pleasure, if it's a dissembling pleasure, if it's a pleasure in the service of making the contracting master feel good about the pleasure. We just can't really tell whether it's a resistant pleasure against other things. We just really can't tell. And even when they want to, as Ray Miller Young and Jennifer Nash have so beautifully talked about, even when they want to reinscribe relations of racial domination within sex work, right, and seek pleasure in that, that is sort of the ultimate liberal capitalist agenda. And then we have this other field of domination, marriage, which, in some cities we find African Americans seeking out these polygamous relationships, and they're not poly relationships, which would be very easy to queer and call radical sex and everything else. These are very conventional polygamous relationships in which people are sort of seeking the conventions of patriarchy within that relationship, but again are claiming sort of this logic, claiming a rhetoric of liberation within a field of domination, right? What I would understand as a field of domination. So I think I'm coming around more and more, to sort of believing that because of the historical conditions in which freedom came to be in the Western world, it may not be that it could be disaggregated from capitalism, and that leaves us in what I would say to my contract students, a bind.
But if I might very briefly, I think everything you say is absolutely correct. But at the same time, I think we're tasked with thinking something beyond post-Enlightenment logics, in which something that we might now only have the provisional language to call freedom exists. So there's something before that, and there's something after it, and that's the quality of what I'm trying to get at.
Capitalism is not.
Yeah.
Saidiya, did you want to say something? Okay, I'm kind of on a fence about time, so can perhaps last comment? Can we defer to Saidiya? Okay.
I don't know if this is just another reiteration of Fred's question, but it actually goes directly to what you were saying, Ronaldo, about a provisional language, and hearing myself quoted all of those qualifiers around what agency is trying to name but can't. So I'm struggling for terms to describe these acts of practice. And Ronaldo, and I wanted to evoke some of your language: self-authorizing, autonomy, a certain kind of bodily integrity on the one hand, and Adrian, your beautiful reading of these cases when the kind of the enactment of wanting to be a subject just kind of, lands your ass back in slavery for all essential purposes. So I guess my question is how to then think that practice not in the domain of the subject any longer, because that's also kind of what we're tethered to with this Enlightenment inheritance. I think it's related to some of the things that Herman was saying on the earlier panel, and Fred. Now it's like maybe the insufficiency of freedom as a term to think the beyond and the outside.
Definitely.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
After this response, we're going to just close and thank the panel.
I think Saidiya. No response. You said it.
You answered your own question.
How long is the break, please?
I'm sorry. Can you take a 5-minute break and come back, please? The live stream is on. The live stream is on. So. Oh, sure.
Thank you. Yeah, I don't think the family is outside capital. The space of the home. No, but the home is not either. But the ways in which we like, experience ourselves are not always circumscribed by capital, and that often happens in the intimacy of. Yeah. Homes are brutal places too. Yeah, I'm not. Yeah. Dad goes to work. Definitely. Yeah. Not valorizing the home as a space of but it's a space where we can have access to cells that we often can't have in the workforce, in public space, and so on. Thank you. Nice to meet you.
I think the resistance to the very idea of thinking, we're trying to drive a wedge between. I know you have a question. Black capitalism is very telling. I did see that in spite of ourselves, after Obama, in this country, we're all neoliberals. Right? And the particularly pernicious effects of the Trump presidency is that the already small space for critiquing Obama's century of the black political imaginary to capitalism is even become more tighter and more constricted. So the resistance is, and also, that's one thing. That's why I asked the question about individualism, because there's also very, very deep sense in which black people in this country, wedded as we are to the myths of radical individualism and of individualism, if not as a concept, as an only vehicle to achieve. Just the possibility of practicing freedom outside because our very mission is human rights as a to these marginal animals. And when you have a president
When you're ready, just click on podium computer, and it'll display whatever is on here. And therefore, you can just. Can I open them all up and have them be? That was hard. Thank you. I appreciate it. That's it also given your particular you're able to see and understand last question, can I reorder them? That one first. Yeah. So when the time comes, I just click on. I can just minimize it here, and then when we're ready, just click on that. And then you click on podium computer, that'll turn on the screen, turn on the projectors. Takes a few seconds to warm up. So thank you very much. Thank you. So I've spoken to you, and I ordered you my son.
my understanding is you're first, you're second.
It's basically alphabetical.
Yeah, yeah.
Oh, it's me. Sorry. Have to be in the side. You have to be in the center. Yes. He's gonna. I think we're already. Oh, you only have one image, right?
Yeah, it's set up.
I have like 3 images, so I might have to speak from the podium. Okay, that's not a problem. Oh no.
I'm gonna do the same thing because it's like it's gonna seem very disruptive for me to just get up and show an image. So.
You gonna speak from this podium too?
Yeah.
I think it wake people up. Wake me up.
Exactly.
And right. I think it's alphabetical as you have a list.
Yeah.
I think that might work. And I believe some people would need to be in podium before they were images. Yeah. So Tavia has an image. Riley have an image.
Yeah, we set it up. They're good to go.
No images. That's very Bergsonian of you, actually. I don't know.
Controversial. So is it that only like 1 or 2 of those blanks really works?
Maybe. Okay. Oh, where do we see from others? There's a.
I know. Yeah.
Okay. Yep. We're ready to go. Okay. So that we can too far. We're gonna speak. Some of us are gonna speak from the podium. That's fine. That's okay. Same idea. Yeah. Okay. Okay. It is.
You both go to the. Do you have problems with time?
We timed it. You know, it's
Exactly.
We're sorry you're leaving.
Travels. Yeah.
We're here in you're here in spirit.
Yeah, I practiced so.
All right. All good.
Exactly. I was like,
I anticipated a lot more.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Hello. I'm just gonna start I'm just gonna say everybody needs to sit.
You're good.
I think by now it's.
Yeah. Good. Yeah.
All right, check. Microphone. Check. 1, 2. What is this? We want to go ahead and get started, so I'll give people a chance to get seated. All right. Greetings and welcome back. Good late afternoon, and welcome to our last panel for the day. That will be followed by closing comments from Saidiya. So the theme of this panel is performance in practice. These esteemed panelists have each theorized how different notions of complexity and ambivalence mark approaches to resistance and the articulation of agency within 19th, 20th, and 21st century Black life. They've given us theoretical tools to grapple with the myriad ways in which social movements and formations of popular culture are often at tension with liberal and heteronormative constructions of the post-racial and multiracial. Without going into all the dimensions of our prompt, to the panelists, I will say that we broadly have asked them each to reflect on the performative as a category of, or maybe and or in need of, liberation within narratives and formations of Black political, cultural, and social life. I'll introduce the panelists now in the order in which they will speak. And just to note, too, at least two of the panelists will be using visuals, so they'll be speaking from the podium. Tavia Nyong'o is professor of African American Studies, and Theater Studies at Yale University. He works in contemporary aesthetic and critical theory with a particular attention to the visual, musical, performative, affective, and technocultural dimensions of Blackness and modern regimes of race. His first book, The Amalgamation Waltz, Race, Performance, and the Ruses of Memory, won the Errol Hill Award for Best Book in African American Theater and Performance Studies. That's from Minnesota Press. He is currently completing a study of fabulation in Black aesthetics and is embarking on another project focusing on queer wildness. He's a co-editor of the journal Social Texts and the Sexual Cultures book series at NYU Press. Jarrett Sexton is Associate Professor of African American Studies and Film and Media Studies at the University of California, Irvine, where he works on critical theory, race and sexuality, coalition politics, and contemporary U.S. cinema. His first book, Amalgamation Schemes, Anti-Blackness and the Critique of Multiracialism, from Minnesota, examines the negative political and philosophical implications of multiracialist ideology within the context of white supremacy and its convergence of racialized and sexualized forms of subjection. More recently, he has edited the volume Racial Theories and Context from Cognella, and has authored the soon-to-be, I guess, hot off the presses, Black Masculinity and the Cinema of Policing, and that's also from Minnesota, correct? Oh, that's from Paul Grave McMillan, okay. C. Riley Snorton is Associate Professor of Africana Studies at Cornell University, where he specializes in cultural theory, queer and transgender theory and history, as well as Africana Studies, Performance Studies, and Popular Culture. His first book, Nobody is Supposed to Know, Black Sexuality on the Down Low, from Minnesota, traces the emergence and circulation of the down low in news and popular culture. His second book, Black on Both Sides, A Racial History of Trans Identity, will be available, I'm told, at this year's ASA conference. So be on the lookout for that. Ooh. It's also published by Minnesota, so we have a lot of Minnesota. Our moderator, Alan Isaac, is Associate Professor of American Studies, Women's and Gender Studies, and English, and he is the Chair of American Studies here at Rutgers. He specializes in Asian American, comparative, ethnic, and post-colonial aspects of contemporary American literary and cultural studies. His book, American Tropics, Articulating Filipino America, from Minnesota, was the recipient of the Association for Asian American Studies, Cultural Studies Book Award. He is currently working on issues of transnational labor and the census, and has been a Fulbright Scholar in the Philippines. Please join me in welcoming our panel.
Thank you, Carter, for that kind introduction, and to
to Marissa and Maisha and the organizers and administrators for this amazing conference. I usually go around academia asking myself this question: how can I be down? And I guess the answer is get an invitation from these people to present at Scenes at 20, because I really feel like what is going down here has been just incredible. Having said that, I'm going to not necessarily deliver on that dynamism of where things ended. I kind of want to continue the conversation about Eric Williams and Milton Friedman, but instead I'm going to talk about Scenes of Subjection and a topic near and dear to my heart, which is ambivalence. Okay, so Scenes of Subjection was not only an intervention into historiography, it was an intervention into critical theory and post-structuralism. Christina Sharp reminded us yesterday of the great power and tenacity of Hartman's questions. If we list all the many questions she addresses to critical theory and post-structuralism over the course of the book, and specifically in chapter 2, which I will focus on today, we gain a sense of the ambition of a book that took on the likes of Marx, Foucault, psychoanalysis, and the theory of performativity, and subjected them to an interrogation, the depth and specificity of which virtually laid out an agenda for Black performance studies. We are very much still answering Hartman's questions. Insofar as the impact of Hartman's relentless questioning tends to be felt especially in the case she makes for ambivalence, Chapter 2, Redressing the Pained Body, can be taken as an outline for a method of theorizing the Black performative act as a mode of living with ambivalence. And that might be my own personal alternative to freedom, is living with ambivalence. And so the question of the impact of this chapter 20 years later becomes an even larger one. How well have we lived with this ambivalence? Not well would be my initial answer, although I invite other responses from my co-panelists and from the audience. Not well, because living with ambivalence can feel intolerable. Its symptoms are often dread, anxiety, doubt, confusion, and inaction. Ambivalence can be a kind of toxin in the political bloodstream, insofar as it can be mistaken for even-handedness, open-mindedness, or just plain wishy-washy behavior. None of these terms, of course, at all captures Hartman's critical ambivalence towards the uses of pleasure in Chapter 2. But the rich and rewarding ensuing polemic between Black optimism and Afro-pessimism we have witnessed in the past decade is in itself the most cogent expression of the moral clarity and righteous indignation that animates Hartman's ambivalence. If ambivalence is hard to live with, it is nevertheless good to think with. And the outline of a Black feminist theory of practice contained in Scenes of Subjection has been nothing if not excellent to think with, as we've been learning all weekend. And what does Hartman mean by practice? Recall that Scenes opens with a chapter focused on race on the theatrical stage, in the slave coffle, and on the auction block. Spectacles of Black suffering. After focusing upon these compelled and spectacular performances in Chapter 1, Chapter 2 turns towards situating such performances within the practice of everyday Black life under slavery. The target of her critique was the new social history, with its emphasis on the autonomy of slave culture, the retention of Africanisms, and the historian's diligent search for signs of agency and resistance under slavery. After arguing that the only agency the chattel could display was a criminal agency, Hartman outlines the ways in which Black speech defies all the normative framing of the Performative Speech Act outlined by J.L. Austin, and even its genteel but anti-normative framing in queer feminist terms by Judith Butler. Hartman shows how insufficient Gramscian models of cultural hegemony are for understanding a slave resistance that could never have access to something like a national popular or class rule. And she rebuts both Afrocentric and communitarian models of intramural Black performance by arguing that even Black performances within the circle do not always provide the longed-for consolation of recognition. Practice is the key heuristic for reassembling a social theory of Black social life in the wake of the cataclysm of enslavement. Instead of agency, identity, or community, Chapter 2 makes a case for what Hartman calls a practice of redress. Redress differs from reparation in that it is not a compensation for loss, insofar as loss is immeasurable, but it is rather an articulation of that loss. Another way of thinking about the articulation of loss might be what Sarah Haley earlier today called thinking dialectically about unknowability. Acts of redress, Hartman argues, are grounded in affects of pain and hunger, in need and desire. Critical history, or what she would later call critical fabulation, is proposed in these pages as memory acts in the service of redress. Redress, I claim, is a Black psychoanalytic and sociogenic theory. If what is at stake here is the task she at one point names liberating the performative, then this liberation of the Black Speech Act can only come through abandoning the grounds upon which Austin and his successors founded the felicity of the Speech Act. To liberate the performative in these terms was in some sense to be liberated from the performative, at least to be liberated from the ideal model of the subject constituted through civic voice and political agency within a public sphere. In looking for agency of the dominated outside the default of the political, this section of Scenes of Subjection entered a vibrant global literature of commitment, one that studies the ways that those without voice attain voice, the manner in which those without a means of direct confrontation with the state or society nonetheless bring that state or society to a state of breach and crisis. Far from dismissing the power of performativity, the defamiliarizing of Black performance Hartman accomplished in this chapter generalized that power beyond what really had been considered before. In a key passage, she notes, and I quote, "It is important to remember that Blackness is defined here in terms of social relationality rather than identity. Thus, Blackness incorporates subjects normatively defined as Black, the relations among Blacks, whites, and others, and 3, the practices that produce racial difference. Blackness marks a social relationship of dominance and abjection and potentially one of redress and emancipation. It is a contested figure at the very center of social struggles." What Hartman modestly describes as a reminder here is actually a cogent and original formulation of how Blackness bears upon what Fred Moten and Stefano Harney would subsequently term the general antagonism. Placed within the context of practice, Black performance is always already a relational theory and an emancipatory figure at the center of every social struggle. Blackness is not the exception, but the rule. The social relationship of dominance and abjection it marks, it really is a case of Black on both sides, as C. Riley Snorton might say, and an aesthetic of all Black everything, as Jared Sexton would have it. But if this Blackness is not the possession of the slave or her descendants, if the pain endured by the enslaved body can never be repaid in monetary compensation for stolen wages, if we, in a sense, remain the living currency of slavery, and I want to think about how living currency may be in dialogue with, but somewhat depart from the idea of a laboring commodity. The living currency of slavery and its afterlives, repeating what Professor Walcott called laboring commodity in the prior panel. Repeating and extending its malignant power and effects through our libidinal economies of bodies and pleasures, then how do we attain to a practice in Black performance studies that is sufficient to this fact? My own work on Afrofabulation in contemporary Black art and performance might best be understood as a long footnote to the passage just cited. And I will leave you with a brief example that I hope captures a sense of what radical ambivalence in performance can be. It is important for my own work that ambivalence not be equated with stasis or resignation, and still less with melancholia. In Victor Turner's account of the social drama, which Hartman evokes in order to transform, redress is followed either by reintegration or schism. Unsettling the simplicity of that either or, redressing the pain body instead works toward an account of slavery that might do justice to what she calls the incompleteness of redress and the constancy of breach and crisis. Contemporary Black theater and performance, I will suggest, steps into that breach and intensifies that crisis. I'm not going to fumble here as I try to turn on my first image. Press enter, maybe? Did I do it? This is it, but I just don't have it turn on screen. Okay, hold on.
Should be
I'll keep talking while we're trying to get the image on in the interest of time. It'll come up, I believe. In Brandon Jacob Jenkins' new play, An Octoroon, which is currently in production at the Shaw Festival in Ontario, thanks to Christina Sharp pointing that out to me today. The young black playwright, I mention it only because I think it's possible that people haven't seen the play, and here's an opportunity to. In Brandon Jacob Jenkins' new play, An Octoroon, the young black playwright satirizes the images of contented degradation in slavery that proliferated on what Douglas Jones has recently termed the captive stage of antebellum American theater. Based upon Anglo-Irish playwright Dion Boucicault's Civil War era melodrama, The Octoroon, and it's a play on words between the and the play employs cross-racial casting, meta-theatrical frames, and contemporary hip-hop and indie rock music in order to pierce through the shell of this crusty old play. Here we go. And there is... Okay, you can ignore the chrome around the image, I guess. The Octoroon, the play employs cross-racial casting, meta-theatrical frames, and contemporary hip-hop and indie rock music in order to pierce through the shell of this crusty old play and revive something like its malignant heart. Insofar as An Octoroon seeks a redress to racial melodrama, the play must necessarily... Thank you. I got it. Thank you so much. The play must necessarily wrestle down the gender tropes of the tragic mulatta, the heroic male slave, the heroic Indian, and the renegade maroon that Scenes of Subjection has so exhaustively interrogated. Indeed, one of Jacob Jenkins' most provocative theatrical creations seems to draw directly from lessons Hartman teaches about the double bind of race and gender in the community of slaves. Here I refer to his redress of two comic relief house slave characters, Minnie and Dido, a pair whose presence in the play is quietly devastating to the racial contract of the American stage. If the suspense of Boucicault's original play relies on a Turneresque social drama of the either-or, schism or reintegration, the arc of these characters demonstrates an alternative confabulation of memory acts in the service of redress, keeping in mind Hartman's distinction between compensation for loss, which she holds to be impossible, and articulation of loss, which she holds is imperative. How does Jacob Jenkins' play redress these two black female characters? To begin, rather than have them speak an offensive 19th century minstrel dialect, Jacob Jenkins voices these two characters as two young black American women of our present day. But Dido and especially Minnie are not just ordinary women, but what present-day slang might term ratchet characters. They are profane and gossipy, earthy and sexual, given over to what Alex Wehelie has just called unbecoming conduct. So unbecoming, indeed, that the field slaves actually leave them behind when they steal away from the plantation. Excluded from the collective communitas of marronage, and doomed to remain part of the impending estate sale that will settle the crippling debts of a dying patriarch, Minnie and Dido are forced to imagine what their lives might be like once they are literally sold down the river. In this scene, they openly bargain with their doom, scheming to be bought by a riverboat captain rather than a local planter. Desperate to avoid being worked to death under the whip on a plantation, Minnie even concocts an impossible fantasy of the good enough life. She imagines, and I quote, and I'll try not to perform this, right? She imagines, quote, coasting up and down the river, looking fly, wind whipping at our hair, and our slave tunics and shit as we are surrounded by all these fine, muscly-boat gentlemen who ain't been with a woman in years. To which Dido, the cautious one, replies, I don't know, Minnie, that sounds kind of dangerous. It's a laughable moment, a laughter fit to kill, to quote Glenda Carpio, made all the more painful by its presentation on a present-day American stage, still captivated by the racial nomos of a white settler colonial society. At one level, the scene depicts the subterranean politics of the enslaved. We are made privy here to the private conversations, schemes, and freedom dreams of two black women held in bondage. At another level, the moment reveals those infrapolitics through a knowing scrim of performance cliché. In an octoroon, we are made conscious of the contiguity between the position of the unthought and the ubiquitous images of black femininity on reality shows like The Real Housewives of Atlanta, hip-hop acts like Cardi B, and queer and trans social media figures like Joanne the Scammer. Minnie's scandalous redress of the pained body begins in the idea that she can somehow scam the auction block. Let us recall that in the play, Minnie and Dido are forced to imagine their riverboat erotic marriage only because they are being sold off to repay the debts of their master. Here, the second half of scenes of Subjection is key, where Hartman reads Reconstruction, in all senses of the word, right, as engaged in impressing upon the freed people their debt to the nation that emancipated them. Debt seeks to singularize and subjectify, to correct and chastise the ostensibly freed subject. Scamming theatricalizes the scene of debt and the scandal of the open market in which we are bought and sold as living currency. It exposes the scene of sale to renegade black performances of confidence and credit. As Minnie and Dido imagine their stolen life, they forcefully project those lives beyond the melodramatic terms of the play in which they appear, estranging the terms upon which we first encounter them, what Daphne Brooks would call an Afro-alienation act. The key Afro-alienation act that Jacob Jenkins ingeniously performs in an octoroon, however, does not occur in this scene in which Minnie and Dido perform what Fred Moten calls fantasy in the hold. It is instead where, towards the end of a play whose plot I have largely omitted retelling here in the interest of time, these two minor characters abruptly comment upon that plot, in a real meta-theatrical coup. And Minnie says, "You know, I would be so pissed if something were to happen that somehow rendered the last 12 hours totally moot." Dido, "Girl, what could happen?" Minnie, "I don't know. Like, if these white folks found out, like, Master Klosky, like, killed Paul or something to intercept the letter that was supposed to save the plantation from being sold. Didn't you get the feeling that something like that could happen at breakfast last week?" The joke here, of course, is that what Dido cannot believe could happen is precisely what the audience has just seen unfold, ostensibly over Minnie and Dido's heads and indifferent to their plight. In this key moment, Jacob Jenkins suspends the dramatic irony which makes his audience privy to the bigger picture and hints at an undercommons of black feminist cunning that circulates along the lower frequencies. He attunes us here to the non-event of emancipation, the double and quadruple consciousness of the slave, as Malik Gaines would have it. In this moment, Jacob Jenkins turns the table on the octoroon, whose basic plot and octoroon has more or less faithfully followed, and inserts an alternative black fable within it. This fable redresses the story of a character that the audience has been laughing at all along. Minnie is nothing like the proper heroine of an octoroon, but she may be its unacknowledged legislator. Although she can be loud, she generally goes unheard. But here, in her penultimate flight of fantasy, her idle concerns open the stage out to a glimpse of the unthought. Unthinking racial melodrama in the practice of the non-event, Minnie feels or senses something more, something missing from the scene of her subjection. Her feeling, which she describes as necessarily and irreducibly shared, is, of course, dread of their own doom. But in her ability to share that sense out with Dido and with us, she enacts the form of practice that I, for one, wish to make my constant study. Thank you.
I'm going to follow tradition. No?
I'm just trying to turn it off, that's all.
Okay. It looks so good from over there. The podium. Besides, we got to warm it up, right? I'll jump right into it and say thanks again to the organizers for this collective effort, to the audience, and for those who are hopefully watching from. That's why I tested it. Okay. Okay. How does this sound? Now I see what people are talking about. Can't be that different. I'll just lean. No, it's okay. I'll just lean in. Yeah. Okay, I'll just stay close. This morning I read a short article by Monique Judge, writing at The Root, about the recent police killing of Patrick Hartman in Salt Lake City. While situating Hartman's death in the broader context of the moment, Judge's conclusion gestures in a different direction. She writes, and I quote, "It's the same refrain. We can keep marching. We can keep chanting. We can keep creating hashtags. We can keep resisting. We can say their names. We can do all these things and watch things never change. Or we can figure out a new plan and make things better. When do we change the narrative? Until something gives, we're going to be left with the same things. No justice, no peace, just crooked police." I think Scenes of Subjection represents an effort to intervene at the level of narrative, but not necessarily by narrative means. It can be read as a sort of forcing, right where things are least, and for the same reason, most likely to give. Refrain, a repeated line, comment, or complaint. Refrain, to stop oneself from doing something, to restrain a thought or feeling. The same refrain. Practice is a politics without a proper locus. Saidiya makes this remarkable point in the second chapter of Scenes, entitled Redressing the Pained Body. There, she draws on the work of Michel de Certeau, James Scott, and Paul Gilroy, among others, to examine what she calls the social relations of slavery and the practices of resistance that traverse these relations. Elsewhere, she describes these practices of resistance as a subterranean politics of the enslaved. And within this tension between these two descriptions, it is unclear whether the subterranean constitutes a descriptively improper locus for a politics, or no locus at all, or whether a politics without a proper locus is only ever a subterranean politics, or one that moves above and below ground in turn. Or whether a dubious politics, we might even say an ironic politics presented between scare quotes, suggests not only a critique of historical analysis that mistakenly attributes proper politics to those forcibly banned from the political as such, but also a critique of contemporary analysis that would mistakenly advance proper politics for those forcibly subsumed by the political as such. Is the problem of or for a black anarchy, as Saidiya phrased it in her recent essay in Brick magazine, is the problem how to enter or escape from the political, or both? Here's the fuller passage, and I quote, "Exploiting the limits of the permissible, creating transient zones of freedom, and re-elaborating innocent amusements were central features of everyday practice for the enslaved. Practice is a way of operating defined by the non-autonomy of its field of action, internal manipulations of the established order, and ephemeral victories. The tactics that comprise the everyday practices of the dominated have neither the means to secure a territory outside the space of domination, nor the power to maintain what is won in fleeting, surreptitious, and necessarily incomplete victories. The refashioning of permitted pleasures in the effort to undermine, transform, and redress the condition of enslavement was consonant with other forms of everyday practice. These efforts generally focused on the object status and castigated personhood of the enslaved, the pained and ravished body, severed affiliations and natal alienation, and the assertion of denied needs. Practice is not simply a way of naming these efforts, but rather a way of thinking about the precariousness of the assaults waged against domination, the transient battles won, the characteristics of a politics without a proper locus. Transient, ephemeral, fleeting, surreptitious, incomplete, precarious. These are the keywords of a practice that refashions the very idea of politics by dispersing it across the entire social field, the subterranean space-time of everyday life, a politics, so to speak, one without a locus of control or coordination or command, whose tactics do not derive from, but rather give rise to a larger strategy only after the fact, if at all. A practice that does not make perfect, one that does not desire perfection in any case. This is a form of redress that doesn't really set things right, or regain composure, or straighten up. The everyday practices of the enslaved occur in the default of the political, writes Saidiya in the same chapter, in the absence of the rights of man or the assurances of the self-possessed individual, and perhaps even without a person in the usual meaning of the term. Practice, then, as persons and politics in the unusual meaning of the terms. I first encountered scenes as a student. I won't say student activist because in light of the above, we can only remain wary of the term, even if activism was formative to my sense of what it meant to be a student and what it meant to study during that part of my life, and even if it remains so today. I was a student looking for answers, or rather looking for better questions on the shelves of the university bookstore at UC Berkeley, when I came across a copy of the paperback edition, having heard for some time from friends and comrades about the title and its author, who taught at the campus at the time. The text did more than pose new questions and reformulate long-standing questions in novel ways. It also struck me as a provocation, a call whose response was not known in advance, or whose response was known, but whose audience, perhaps not unlike its author, didn't want to know anything about the nonetheless unavoidable knowledge. A text whose prose reveals in its expression as much as in its content something of the toll it took to compose it, and the toll it would take to read it. A text inscribed by recurrent and overlapping technical terms, dense and often necessarily discrepant conceptual claims, a text betraying a jagged, almost overfull prospectus for future study, right alongside the painstaking findings and heartbreaking conclusions of its research. I encountered scenes before I read it, which happens sometimes with great books or scandalous ones, and this text is surely something of both. It may be hard to recall on this platinum anniversary, where all in attendance rightly agree on the profound significance of the study and its major arguments, and whose power has only been amplified by the subsequent and forthcoming publications. But the early reception of scenes was marked by a bit of scandal as well, one no doubt linked to its uncanny pertinence and troubling veracity, one that has permutated in ways that have genuinely surprised, even as the scandal has in some ways become more and not less subterranean, dropping below the audible frequency, becoming for many more felt than heard, like undulating notes from underground. And I mean scandal as the highest compliment, of course, having to do with the sort of shock to the system that one enjoys when reading something for which they weren't really prepared, and then realizing upon reflection that something important, some aspect or other, maybe even whole ways of thinking and feeling, have become exposed as a result. The exposure is exciting and embarrassing, stimulating and shameful all at once. Like any book, Scenes is not sui generis, of course, but it manages uniquely to combine and consolidate varied and even divergent traditions of critical theory in a sweeping history of the 19th century United States. And that's putting it too modestly, because Scenes is really about the long 19th century, dating back to the American Revolution at least, and extending well into the Civil Rights era, a period that, among other things, generates the broad dynamics of abolitionism and Reconstruction and the defenses of slavery and segregation on either side of the US Civil War. Likewise, the focus on the US is more nodal than anything else, a means of tracking what are essentially global scale developments. At the highest level of abstraction, Scenes is concerned with understanding the rise and advocating for the fall of the American crucible, the making of transatlantic slavery, and the whole battery of principles, products, persons, and procedures that it brings into the modern world, none of which is restricted to these particular spatiotemporal parameters. So, wherein lies the scandal? In part, I think, in what might be called the anti-historicist historicization offered by the text. Historicization in the positive sense that we can and must account for the active formations of power. Anti-historicist in the negative sense that we cannot and must not reduce to history the trans-historical formations of the unconscious. And I'm struck by the fact that the word unconscious hasn't been spoken, as far as I know, in the last 2 days, but it's central to the text. Saidiya demonstrates to that end that any thinking of the problem of performance, that is, the problem of what can be done as much as what is being done, together or alone, individually or institutionally, socially or structurally, has also necessarily to do with a certain scenography, a psychopolitical staging or mise en scène, alongside a historiography, or how best to write history, and a philosophy of history, what to make of history so written. When this question of performance is broached with respect to the history of enslavement and its transformation in and through the invention of racial whiteness and blackness, when performance is broached with respect to those enslaved in the name of such whiteness and blackness, those who Saidiya later suggests inhabit the position of the unthought, then whatever bearings might be ready to hand, African cosmologies, Abrahamic religions, Enlightenment thought, are invariably distended and deranged, and not in a process of historical evolution, but in a frozen moment of permanent rupture. We must tell a story thereafter, but we do so without template. Better said, we must tell a story while facing too little and too much template at the same time. This is not the problem, so exhaustingly familiar to the activist milieu today, of turning common sense into good sense, of organizing a class in itself into a class for itself. This is the problem, or rather the problematic, of what happens after any such good sense and attendant self-directed activity is detonated by shock waves of unimaginable magnitude, and the subsequent conditions are shaped by continuous preemptive strikes. Or like the afterlife of a stellar collapse, wherein a singular point undergoes a change of state in a black hole. Complexity and ambivalence only begin to describe the articulation of performance within Black life across this longue durée. With Scenes, we confront the implications of thinking space and time not as fundamental elements of nature, but rather as functions of scale, moving between the quantum physics of close reading and the astrophysics of a different historical meta-narrative toward a unified field theory of the non-event. At either extreme, space-time is suspended in the infinitely small non-locality of being simultaneously here and there, then and now, and in the infinitely large expanse where one contemplates the edges of the universe in connection with its impossible beginning. The non-event, an expected event that fails to take place or to satisfy expectations, or a highly publicized event of little intrinsic interest or significance, but also an occurrence that is officially ignored or unrecognized, which marks the unlikely and, for the same reason, the likely difference between emancipation and freedom. If there is something to say about the lasting power of Black performance here, aesthetic, social, political, then it might issue from the fact that such practice is, at its best, undertaken with great understanding of, but little respect for, socio-temporal parameters as such. A practice with no hope of winning anything for long, or at all. Undertaken, as Saidiya puts it, with the acknowledgement that conditions will most likely remain the same. A way of operating, in other words, without the presumption of innocence for any of those things hidden since the foundation of the world, least of all, for ourselves, by ourselves.
Try to set everything up at all at the same time. So first of all, okay, the mic should be okay. I need to, all right, let's see. VGA, what? Okay. What? Oh, I see. Yeah, so it's on the VGA. Yeah, yep. So you should just hit enter. Nothing. Okay. Well, I will then get started and it's sort of in there. So, okay, first I'd like to add my thanks to many of the other, to many others, to Maisha, Carter, Marisa, Lisa, the administrative staff, to my fellow panelists, both on this panel and throughout the weekend, especially for Saidiya and for the occasion, to think around scenes of subjection, which, like Erica mentioned, and as was brought up again in the last panel, has the quality of a religious text in which every page provides critical instruction in and out of order, and to which I'd add, in my experience, and perhaps as an echo of Ronaldo's comment, always feels new each time I reread, and it's in so much as I'm always reminded of how the work has shaped my thinking at the level of the sentence and the phrase. In her chapter, Redressing the Pained Body, thank you. Yep. Saidiya Hartman attends to the transversally related modes of performance and practice. Transversal in so much as, and as Jared's talk explained, practice performs a reconsideration of the stakes of politics without a proper locus. And as Tav's paper pointed out, Black performance in a Hartmanian sense elaborates upon a condition of living and thinking with ambivalence. In the time that I have, I'd like to think about the relationality of performance and practice as a way to think about another transversal relation between fungibility and fugitivity, which finds frequent and reiterative articulation in pro-slavery and abolitionist media in the 19th century, according to cross-dressing and theft. And that might be understood in the present as a compounding condition of living in the afterlife of slavery, as well as in the afterlives of gendering. Fungible, according to its etymology, first appeared in the English language in Henry Colebrook's Treatise on Obligations and Contracts, Part 1, in 1818. Colebrook, having spent a considerable period of his life as a colonial bureaucrat and judge in India, returned to England to write about the particularities of British contract law. Fungible articles, which he delineated according to their characteristic quantifiability, quote, alike liquidate and exigible, required legal definition in relation to matters of compensation. Yet Colebrook maintains, quote, even things which are not fungible may be subjects of compensation, being due under general obligation, respectively, as cattle, slaves, horses, end quote. The variegated landscape of enslavement, its applications, abrogations, and diffuse rationales staged the grounds for fungibility to emerge as a legal intercession intra and internationally. How then would the slave, as not fungible and as a subject of compensation, come to emblematize a series of crises in imperial sovereignty, value, and ontology in the twilight of formal slavery and the non-event of emancipation? Relatedly, how did the legal categorization of the slave in Saidiya's terms link, quote, the figurative capacities of blackness with the fungibility of the commodity, unquote? The narrative of Mary Jones, also known as the Man Monster, also known as Beefsteak Pete, stages how the fungibility of black gender mapped a terrain for fugitive passage. Even as the cross-gender aspects of fugitive escapes titillated abolitionist audiences, they also required resignification in order to present these incidents as examples of the extreme measures fugitives took to escape the problems of slavery, rather than as a contingency of a contemporaneous pseudoscientific project that linked blackness with gender and sexual polymorphous perversity. Most often, this was achieved by framing such cross-gendered modes of escape in terms of cunning wit on the part of the fugitive actor, who manages to successfully assume and maintain an unnatural performance of artifice. In this narration, passing expresses a form of agency as well as a promise of restoration. And I'm thinking about these in terms of the kind of mythos of both of those concepts, which is to say that passing as a limited durational performance signals a quote-unquote return to a naturalized biopolitical mode of being. This narratological strategy shaped how passing would be deployed as an interpretive frame for all manners of trans-identificatory practices, both contemporaneously and reiteratively into the 20th and 21st century. No less performative, but lacking a clear biologized semiotic referent, fungibility expresses how ungendered blackness provided the grounds for trans performances for freedom. By describing such acts as performances for rather than of, I'm signifying how Mary Jones illustrates how the inhabitation of the ungender specific and fungible also mapped the affective grounds for imagining other qualities of life and being for those marked by and for captivity. Harriet Jacobs referred to this vexed affective geography as something akin to freedom, that perhaps paradoxically required a deliberate calculation of one's fungible status. Following Jacobs and, of course, Hartman, I'd like to linger on the ungendering of blackness as it became a site of fugitive maneuvers wherein the dichotomized and collapsed designations of male man masculine and female woman feminine remained open, that is fungible, and the black's figurative capacity to change form as a commoditized being engendered its flow. According to New York Herald, Mary Jones took a tour of pleasure with Robert Haslam, a white master mason, one summer night in 1836, probably somewhere near the Green Street Bordello, where Jones was a greeter and performed cooking and assorted domestic tasks for other sex workers associated with the popular brothel. After their transaction, Jones and Haslam parted ways, with Jones carrying Haslam's wallet in tow. It was a perilous exchange which required skill and with which Jones apparently had much practice. According to news coverage and the arresting officer's account, Jones was found with several wallets on her person at the time of capture. When Haslam eventually realized that his wallet and $99 were taken and replaced with another wallet containing a bank order for the then sizable sum of $200, rather than accepting his good fortune, he tracked down the second wallet's initial owner, convincing the other man to accompany him in reporting the crime. They, along with the arresting officer and the officer's brother, devised and executed a plan to apprehend Jones that night. Jones was tried for grand larceny on June 16, 1836, in the Court of General Sessions. Induced to appear before the court in the same clothes worn on the night of her arrest, Jones was, as Tav has described, quote, roundly mocked and prodded by a gawking and contemptuous crowd in a surreal, spectacular scene. Asked at trial to account for her dress before the court, Jones responded, quote, "I have been in the practice of waiting upon girls of ill fame, and they induced me to dress in women's clothes, saying I look so much better in them. And I have always attended parties among the people of my own color dressed in this way. And in New Orleans, I always dressed in this way," end quote. Though the context of her confession undoubtedly shaped this response, Jones's description of three distinct, although related geographies, the Green Street brothel, the parties among people of her own race in New Orleans, where she, quote, "always dressed in this way," named variously scaled sites in which Jones's gender expression as an intramural protocol was met with a reception at odds with the ridicule she faced that day in the Court of General Sessions. Though Jones pled not guilty, the Herald reported that the jury, quote, "after consulting a few moments, returned with a verdict that found her culpable of the crimes of which she was charged." She was sentenced 2 days later to 5 years of hard labor at Sing Sing. Approximately 1 week after the trial, the lithographic portrait, "The Man Monster," began to appear in print shops across New York City. Without the inclusion of a sequence of names engraved below the figure as Peter Seawally, alias Mary Jones, etc., or the description of Jones's sentencing, the image would seem to have portrayed, as Jonathan Ned Katz has argued, quote, "a rather ordinary-looking and unthreatening black woman in a clean white dress with small blue flowers," end quote. The New York World's description of her courtroom appearance was perhaps a referent to the subsequent caricature, referring to Jones as attired à la mode de New York, elegantly and in perfect style. Quote, his dingy ears were decked with a pair of snow-white earrings, his head was ornamented with a wig of beautiful curly locks, and on it was a gilded comb, which was half hid among the luxuriant crop of wool, end quote. The image's profitable reproducibility created a different, albeit familiar, articulation of racial sexual exchange in which white value accrued in relation to black unfreedom, as the story of Jones's carceral life produced revenue for printmakers throughout the city. The rise in lithographic production altered the imagistic landscape of slavery. As Jasmine Cobb notes, lithography advanced the circulation of caricatures as well as newspapers and advertisements for runaways, contributing to a visual culture that readily enlisted whites to search for black people. As a result, abolitionists hesitated to depict free black people in image form, choosing instead to pursue the question of and quest for black emancipation in and through text. Because lithography was instrumentalized in enslaving culture, the image of the man monster elicited a reading that worked on multiple registers, as caricature gave expression to the particularity of Jones's media spectacle and the visual antagonism toward imagining black freedom. In this sense, and in its depiction of a, quote, rather ordinary-looking black woman, the interplay of the lithograph's title and image worked to confirm a contemporaneous common sense about the fungibility of blackness, in which the interchangeability of gender figured one aspect of blackness's capacity as it traversed captivity. As Jones's commoditized caricature gave rise to a meditation on the gender fungibility of black flesh during slavery, her salacious coverage in the penny press illustrated that the matter of black freedom was equally vexed in print. Newspapers focused on the details of her quote-unquote disguise and on the question of whether Haslam recognized the gender of his sexual partner at the moment of their transaction. The Sun told its readership in Latin how Jones engaged in sex acts with her clients by wearing, quote, a piece of cow leather pierced and open like a woman's womb held up by a girdle, end quote. This detail, apparently appropriate only for the eyes of the educated upper class, gave rise to the epithet Beefsteak Pete, which appeared recurrently in subsequent media coverage. Though Jones initially served time for grand larceny in the mid-1840s, she would reemerge in the press in relation to charges of vagrancy, another iteration of theft, which pivoted on her public perambulations and the appearance of freedom. And repeatedly in 1844 and 1845, she emerges in the press in relation to being put back in jail. So although it's not possible to declare definitively and with all the force of the historical record whether Jones's attire of women's clothes was a matter of personal definition, a kind of trans self-fashioning, it's clear that the practice of cross-dressing, a process without a stable gender referent, created an imaginative context for Jones and her Johns, as the ungendering of blackness created a space for emergence within dynamics of political, economic, and cultural modes of exchange. This practice of emergence was most frequently criminalized criminalized, such that, as Jones's narrative bears out, theft describes the manner with which, and this is of course Hartmanian, with which free blacks were seen as being in illicit possession of themselves. And their perambulations, according to the logics of antebellum law, the press, and popular culture requiring carceral containment as a response. So in an article that's published in October 2nd, 1908 in the Virginia Enterprise, Beefsteak Pete, quote unquote, a Bowery character, was reported to have consumed 17 pounds of meat, from which he takes his cognomen at one setting, and 5 days later, he raised this figure to 24 pounds, thus making a total of 41 pounds of meat consumed in 2 days. And here I want to flag to what Fred was saying yesterday about exhaustion. Here, Jones, in the twilight of her life, attempted to re-signify that epithet constituted by the flesh of what Tav describes as a surrogate vagina into a gastronomic record based on no less spectacular form of consumption. As an anecdote and an archival trace, Jones's carnivorous feat illustrates what Vincent Woodward has argued as the question that emerged long before the poignant question of the color line and the Negro problem, as that more pressing problematic of how does it feel to be an edible consumed object. The temporal collapse of Du Bois's paradigmatic analysis and Jones's archival installation signals how the logics of consumption and exchange would continue to delineate Black flesh. As this resignification occurred by way of eating, which, as Keila Tompkins has described, functioned in 19th century print culture to, quote, attach extreme commodity pleasure to non-white bodies, Jones's gastronomic record conjoins and highlights the tacit link between certain gustatory practices and aspects of masturbatory gratification. Consuming her surrogate flesh to make a new meaning for her name, Jones exemplifies what Spillers explains in her noted essay on psychoanalysis and race, that, quote, there is an aspect of human agency that cannot be bestowed or restored by others, such that eating in this sense becomes a tactic for gaining agency that is not an arrival but a departure, not a goal but a process. So as an erotic act that emerges by way of familiar, if not commonplace, practice of racial consensual exchange, eating precipitates the question, what is the discourse of sexuality to the fungible? A demonstration of at least a temporal disordering of psychoanalytic and sexological rubrics in which these particular acts may be regarded as a psychosexual regression from the genital to the oral phase. Jones's archival installation also evinces how amalgamation sometimes occurs by way of mastication, wherein the combining of flesh, both hers and not hers, exists as a relay between self-fashioning and an ever-pressing out there. Here, Jones's mouth serves as a double function of processing food into digestible matter and in producing sense, wherein the eating in this regard becomes a way, as Tompkins has argued, to re-embody oneself both as food and as its container. Perhaps this reading figures Jones as ever the pragmatist, whose calculation to eat as much as she could of that stigmatized surrogate flesh produced a record in the archive of self-revision by way of accumulation and consumption. This is a consequence of reading the archive for gender as an always racial and racializing construction, as Saidiya Hartman asked us to do. That, in this instance, provides a way for thinking about what forms of redress are vexedly possible in/as flesh. Thank you.
themselves and sharing this weekend together. And this generosity is about generating things that we don't know. It's quite indeterminate. That indeterminate. Sorry, I can actually lower my voice now. As to the results of this generosity and sharing of each other, and of course on the occasion of the celebration of Professor Hartman's book, Scenes of Subjection. The panelists this afternoon, this last panel, talked about redress as articulation of loss and disruption as found in performative practice. Given that terror and power is diffuse, as we were speaking about yesterday, Professor Hartman had exhorted us to see, hear, be sensible to, and discern these diffuse practices of redress. That we have to actually be to discern the temporal disordering that diffuse articulations make possible. That is much like the overturned pot, that we have to capture the inaudible voices of this articulation. And I wanted to actually just point to some concepts and keywords that I think the panelists, that struck me at least. That first, what Riley was speaking about, the simultaneous meanings and multivalence of redress. That is to say, both in the legal, social, sexual, and bodily practices that capture the fungibility of body and gender, and therefore body and gender as a field of practice and articulation itself. And what was exciting, actually, when you ended the notion of transformation through mastication, I like that very much precisely because it has no guarantees. It could, in fact, be incomplete. It could actually make you sick. It could actually make you actually spit it out. But yet it is inevitably transformed, hence sort of the ambivalence and therefore unknowability of the result itself. So I want to actually keep masticating and thinking about sort of the notion of ambivalence that Tavia had brought up, which of course we see also in Jared's work about the politics and practice without the presumption of innocence, which is to say there is the imperfect and impossible outcomes that we're waiting for. That the position of the unthought, as Professor Hartman had pointed to, deranges, even as we all were in graduate school and currently in our own work, deranges the questions that we were given by our disciplines, and certainly deranges the practices or ways we operate within the university and how we articulate our work as well. But I want to see how to think about ambivalence and its relationship to the position of the unthought by just introducing two types of relationship. Ambivalence is the position of the unthought, or ambivalence from the position of that unthought. How to parse that sentence by moving that particular word position, whether it's about created improper loci, the created locus, or is it about taking on new meaning. That is to say, it qualifies and therefore the ambivalence itself has to be rethought, right? And ambivalence, of course, what in the previous panel, precisely what scale is that ambivalence, whether that moment of the tweet or moment in which we see it in this national scale or where we see it in the capitalist scale as well. So all those things are put in flux in relation to each other. And Tavia, I just wanted to continue to talk about ambivalence as really a generative structure of feeling, right? Structure of feeling as both a thinking and a feeling itself. That ambivalence is to always feel and think multiplicities. But I want to also put in the notion of valence in Chemistry 101, the notion of valence as capacity, as strength, as also the pulls and the gravities that make possible difference or transformations. So the notion of ambivalence or multivalence is about multiple capacities and how those multiple elements, in fact, perhaps amplify each other, right? Rather than simply you move through one or the other. But it could be, in fact, an amplification. And it is perhaps an amplification of the fabulation, the fables, fantasy, and politics itself, that each one actually, it's not separate, but it could be disruptive, but it also can conjoin to amplify. So I just want to end, for the sake of time, back to the question that you proposed, Tav, and for the audience itself. How well have we lived with this radical or not ambivalence, both in the Obama era and then also currently in the Trump era. So I just invite the panelists to respond to each other that way. Thank you.
You already know my answer.
Oh, yeah,
not so well. So maybe someone else wants to. Why ambivalence? Because it's in the text, and because the no, because actually I'll say why. The Living with Ambivalence is a title of an essay about the reparative position. So it gets us into thinking about psychic economies of the unthought. And there is a whole kind of Kleinian account of ambivalence, which is actually the product of course, we know the simultaneity of both love and hate, but also the simultaneity of, or the sequencing of a certain kind of aggression followed by reparation, right? So the ambivalent, we are ambivalent towards, we make ambivalent efforts towards repair and or redress precisely because there is this unconscious aggression towards it, right? So that's why it means something for me. What about you? I think this one works. I'm going to try this one. How does this get right up there? One of the things I see people do often with the use of the word ambivalence is they confuse it for confusion, or mixed feelings, or ambiguity. And for me, why it's powerful is because, as you said, Tavi, it's not just that it's the simultaneity of powerful emotions, convictions even, like love and hate, but of the ways in which the tension that's generated by that coeval presence is something that the one who suffers ambivalence doesn't know about. And that's an important thing. We don't just work with ambivalence. We attempt to, but we also suffer ambivalence. And it's important for us to, I think, to think about the ways in which we're structured ambivalently, because there's a difference between developing a language of freedom, for instance, and developing a desire for it. I'll say that one more time. There's a difference between developing a language of freedom and developing a desire for it. And we shouldn't presume that there is a desire for freedom, or only a desire for freedom. That's one of the lessons I learned reading Scenes of Subjection, and one of the reasons why when I read the book, I didn't say thank God at first, I said, oh no. And I had to keep putting it down as I read it, because it undermines so many of the basic categories that I use and kind of grounding assumptions that I had for thinking about history, for thinking about the political, for thinking about the social, for thinking about aesthetics, so forth and so on. But for thinking about questions of the mind, right? And the interiority that is denied from the beginning by the institution of enslavement, and not just for those who are doing the enslaving. This is for me one of the most challenging aspects of a theoretical text that's written for a Black audience, which I think Scenes is. And there aren't a lot of them. There's more of them now. There weren't a whole lot in the 90s, not yet. But for those who think that Scenes is an intervention on the traditional disciplines, that's a byproduct of, I think, its initial impetus, which is how do we talk among Black audiences about what it means to live in the afterlife of slavery, which is the question we inherit. Right? And that question has everything to do with living with ambivalence, which is to say, living not just with a language of freedom and a language of enslavement,
but with a desire for freedom and a desire for enslavement at the same time, right? We talk a lot about getting free, but we don't talk about the ways in which that's not the only thing we want. That's not the only thing that we desire. That's why ambivalence for me.
Thank you. So I'll just to kind of thread a little to think about ambivalence as the co-articulation of repulsion and desire, and to think then about what this bears upon the first panel, that maybe what is percolating here in some ways is to think about ambivalence as the affect of histories of violence, right? Such that, again, to sort of link up to Alex's comment, right? This is another way of saying there is no such thing as thinking oppression and resistance is somehow inextricable from one another. Yeah, I'll leave it there.
Yeah, this. Thank you very much. They were great. And I'm especially co-signing, Jared, on that ambivalence with regard to scenes and other work too by people here, where you have to keep putting it down. I still have to keep putting it down. But I'm wondering now about, maybe, I don't even know if it would be right to talk about it in terms of an experience of ambivalence. Is ambivalence endemic to a subject? When we say that we live with or try to live with ambivalence, is that we a collectivity of subjects or would-be subjects or thwarted subjects, or is that we some other kind of thing or non-thing? And if it is it bounded by ambivalence? In other words, if there is an ambivalence of the non-subject or of the non-subject, the non-subjective, or maybe even the simultaneously pre and post-subjective, does that ambivalence manifest itself as a bind or as a potential gateway?
Or a gateway, a bind or a gateway. A vestibule even. In that case, the answer would be yes. That's part of what I tried to signal by bringing up the notion of the non-event, these different notions of the non-event. We've talked about the non-event of emancipation quite a bit, and rightly so. It's non-arrival, it's disappointment, etc. But also the ways in which what is publicized about it has been of little intrinsic worth, or interest or significance for those concerned. But the other notion of the non-event as an occurrence that is officially ignored or unrecognized, which I aligned with freedom, was the way that I tried to think about that experience of ambivalence in a collective sense. That there is a non-event, yes. There's a non-event which is both of those things. But as we talk about it, each of us in our own ways talked about this kind of spatiotemporal derangement or reconfiguration that was underway, or the kind of crisis that it goes into. Thinking about the non-event in that double sense now means that we can't just talk in the same terms that we've received about then and now, about here and there, about us and them. And that's the other thing that has been kind of, for me, circulating around when you raise this question of a we or an us or the collectivity that Ronaldo was talking about, how Black people self-authorize or make bids for a kind of self-authorization or an autonomy even. None of that presumes collectivities, presumes them, but it does talk about the practices which give rise to them as something which is not taken for granted, right? Not taken for granted in some ethnographic sense. I think that's part of what I was trying to signal with that split within the non-event. That's where the ambivalence would be an experience and not just the affect of histories, lived histories of violence, as Riley just mentioned. Not only that, rather.
Thank you, Fred, for that. That's a, I guess, there must be an experience of ambivalence. Yes, I would say yes, and an ambivalence of the non-subject. I want to get at that question by thinking again about this character. And again, I apologize, not everyone here is necessarily is in the same play that I am, right? But the reason I'm really like obsessed with the character of Minnie in Octoroon, right, is because, Brandon's approach in the play is to take this whole melodrama, the whole premise of which is it's basically a Turner in, it's like schism or reintegration, right? But the schism is Black freedom, reintegration is like continuation on the plantation as and the brilliance of this sort of subplot, right, is to sort of point out that both the schism and the reintegration is a non-event, right? From the perspective of Minnie, who stands in for not just herself, right, but this sense of, I would say, collectivity. You would say consent not to be a single being, right? That there is maybe you would say that. You can hear you say not, but in part this sort of like coming into that role, right? This is actually where the performative. There's so many risks in staging that play, right? There's so many risks in the way in which those characters, even though they're not minstrel characters, can become minstrel characters when they circulate, for instance, on the internet or something, right? So here I go talking about like the liveness of performance. I don't know, that's so embarrassing. But performing the multiplicity of that character who sort of endures within the ambivalence of her situation, the non-event of emancipation, that then also becomes another way of being, right? That's the best I can do, Is it a gateway? I think there are, at least in terms of like the play, there are other kind of gateways that I see, other character, Brer Rabbit has a gateway. He gets out of the play, right? There's a character called Brer Rabbit, right? But Minnie doesn't, right? So there's actually a relation between this kind of evocation of Joel Chandler Harris, in the play, and this contemporary moment of experiencing ambivalence.
Hi, thank you all for your presentations, and I think there are a lot of common threads, so I'm interested in pursuing them in my question to you all. And also, it's a reference to Ronaldo Walcott's interest in the collectivity, and specifically the collective as a deformation of the subject. So I'm thinking of how in the dialectic of enlightenment, Adorno and Horkheimer are kind of figured the subject as Odysseus, and I haven't even read the Odyssey or anything like that, but Odysseus manages selfhood or manages subjecthood, manages to come into being by or through his cunning, by escaping the kind of trials on his way home. And so I hear the reference to cunning in your talk, Professor Nyong'o. And when you were talking about the Black feminist cunning of the characters Minnie, I wrote down Brer Rabbit. So it's interesting that there's, and I haven't seen the play, so it's interesting that there's a figure called Brer Rabbit. And I was wondering if for Adorno and Horkheimer, cunning is that which enables the integration of consciousness and the development of the subject. If we want to deform the subject, it seems to me that the play you're addressing is offering a way that cunning can deform the subject, a different kind of cunning, maybe a cunning that draws on an African inheritance. I don't know. But I also heard, I think I heard threads of that in everybody's talk. So I was wondering about cunning as a kind of practice in the sense of a politics without a proper locus, cunning as theft over and against capitalist logics of consumption and exchange. So yeah, I hope what I'm saying is like is coming together. But yeah, I was just wondering if you all could talk about how a practice might manifest itself as theft, as a refusal of containment, as a refusal of expropriation, as a refusal of capitalist logics, again, to draw on Ronaldo Walcott's comments. And then Professor Stern, you referenced the co-articulation and desire, which it seems to me also might be a kind of, or might be a way to think about cunning in its relation to ambivalence. I don't know. So hopefully that provokes something. Testing. Okay, great. Okay, so I'll start where you began in terms of my use of cunning in my paper, which was about a kind of production of a narrative of fugitives, um, those living in the time of slavery, as somehow tricking people by through disguise in order to show up as an alternative gender than one that is being in that very moment of calling them cunning, being invented and maintained and secured as some sort of naturalized position in gender. And so for me, cunning as a practice, at least in the example I gave, is not necessarily the kind of space of practice that I think Ronaldo was calling forth in terms of kind of collectivity against genre, against the kind of dominant sociogenic code that gives rise to our current genre of man. But I'm really curious, and I'm trying to hold it in my mind. You asked about cunning's relationship potentially to, right, as it relates to repulsion and desire. And I guess part of what that brings up for me then is like, if we think about how, in fact, something like the legal and medical understanding of enslaved as fungible is actually capacitating some sort of escape that is still, to riff on Fred's the title of one of his books of poetry, that you run from it and are still in it. Right, that like I'm trying to think about the gender that is not given, that is still yet, that then becomes a space for remaking, that may not be something like redress in the form of justice, but that is actually what is possible as a kind of space for maneuver given the context in which in which the context that was given. Yeah.
Really quick, I mean, this is for me a very hooray for us moment. It's really exciting to be here to hear the sort of quality of thinking. I guess I've been waiting 20 years to ask this question. It seems like we have. It's like, are we at? I almost took a point. We're in the wake of scenes. Are we at a moment where we can start to think about the notion of like the Middle Passage, maybe as an emancipatory moment? I'm just curious. I didn't want to say more. I want them to respond to it. I just throw out the notion of the Middle Passage as an emancipatory moment, and if we're at the point where I think clearly scenes of subjection starts to open it up, but I'm not sure if it does. For me, it did, and so I'm wondering if we could have some thoughts about it, if possible.
And this is a question about, it's a question about practice for Jared and Tavia. And I guess I'm thinking about practice and its relation to politics. Practice as a certain refusal to enter a scene of politics, or the impossibility, or escaping it altogether, as it relates to not living well and as it relates to the scene of Black Death that you opened with. And so then how do we think about that kind of the acts of practice that will be required? I don't know if you want to imagine living well, Tavia, or what is then the response to then that anticipated scene?
And those are two different questions, maybe, about the Middle Passage as emancipatory, and how to think about that anticipated scene of Black Death as something other than a moment for politics. And that's why I was actually struck by Judge's comment in that article, whose job is in part to chronicle these deaths as they're happening in real time. And as she's doing it, she's saying to us, we don't have the narrative means to account for these non-events that I'm accounting for. And what I say I want is another narrative that can give an account. And yet I don't have a narrative that can do that. And maybe none of us do. But until we can change something, come up with a new plan, and maybe those aren't the same thing. A change in narrative and a new plan may not be the same thing, then we're going to get the same things. We'll be left, she says, with the same things. I guess for me, what that collapse between politics and practice that I think that you're identifying in scenes and sense, where we can't tell where one stops and the other starts, or what the relative utility of each might be. The notion of operating without the presumption of innocence does not mean that we operate with the presumption of guilt that's otherwise attributed to us. It's operating in a way that says we'll assume the guilt, but only so we can eventually destroy guilt and innocence, both. And I think that there's a sensibility that I'm trying to get at, which is more than the identification of a set of practices that I find exemplary or that provide a model, but a sensibility that would inform those things, almost a spirit, which would say, I will not quest after the innocence which is denied me. I will assume it and presume it, not just because it's defiant, but because it's truer than saying I'm innocent. See, and we need to be able to develop a practice that starts there, right? In which we don't need to be innocent to one another, at least of all to ourselves, before we can start to infuse a practice with a different sensibility, something that might give rise to a change of narrative, but may not need to, right? May relate to that narrative differently.
Yeah, I agree with that. I'm inspired by that. I mean, what can I add? I mean, two things. One, to AJ's provocation, right? Thanks for dropping that at the very end, But also, like, it took me a minute, right? Because I was like, it actually kind of brings us back to not just to the to kind of like the originary scenes of Black literature, meaning like Phyllis Wheatley, right? "'Twas mercy that brought me here from Afric's shore," or words to that effect, right? So your question actually is sort of like embedded, right, in the whole journey of this project that we're going to continue on from here on out, right? How to live with this ambivalent, and the ambivalence that Black literature has had with Phyllis Wheatley, right? And maybe now we have another conference, right? So that's what I would say to that, and to Jared's point, but to Riley's point about fungibility, and Jared's point about the desire for freedom and the desire for unfreedom, right? So when I said earlier that I'm thinking about, it's not a question of whether, for instance, like the character Minnie, can live well or desires to live well, or can imagine. Actually, there's a whole fantasy of the good life, right? On the riverboat, right? And the play kind of invests us in all those kinds of desires. There's also, what the tension is that in that fantasy, she is also living currency, right? And living currency at the level of unconscious fantasy, right? There's like a general libidinal economy of the general antagonism, right? Which is embedded in every part of that performance, right? And it's what causes it to extend into the present, right? It causes it to resonate with the anarchy of Black girls united in a riotous manner into the, that's what I think the theatrical choice was, to sort of disrupt the verisimilitude of the 19th century and kind of present present day characters, so characters in a present day voice, right? That estranging effect, right, is, I think, precisely to to give us a sense of what this general libidinal economy is, and it's an experience of ambivalence, and it's a collective experience, and part of the collectivity for me is, it's anti-historicist historicism with an emphasis on historicism. I don't know. Well, only because I kind of want to think about accumulation, right, and surrogation, right, and sort of what does it mean? Not because I want to think about psychic economies of debt, right, and I just think that the way that this whole the way we're thinking about psychic economies of debt is clearly something that extends beyond my answer here, so I'll shut up. But thank you for the question.
Thank you for the.
We're going to introduce you. Yes, we're going to introduce you. Okay. So this is going to be very quick, our introduction, because we know you're waiting to hear from Saidiya. So I think we should just do that.
So we just want to start where we can start, which is to thank Saidiya for being such a fantastic mentor and teacher, who has been at once exacting, extraordinarily generous for sure, and always fiercely protective of her students. Her model of integrity, humility, and breathtaking clarity in her purpose to write about what matters and to write so beautifully humbles and inspires us. Saidiya, we want to thank you for your attentiveness and your protection, for modeling how to protect our time and spirit in this place, for your grace and generosity always, and for seeing us. We know that 20 years in, you've only just begun. This celebration is not a culmination, but a moment to pause, to take breaths, to consider what has been, and to imagine what yet will be. Everyone, please help us welcome Dr. Saidiya Hartman.
Wow. It's so beautiful to derange together. Okay, so this is just a love note. 2 decades later, she was still in the thick of it, still in the interval of the no longer and the not yet. The weather had not changed. She couldn't see clearly what she had done because she was still trying to do it, still trying to figure out how life is undone and made again, attend to how it unfolds in the space of death, still trying to write about and for Black life, to convey the beauty and the terror of the everyday. Every ending was a beginning that returned her to the problem. Every beginning was an attempt to think through the set of questions: can we live and how can we live? To consider again, better than she had, always reckoning with her own terrible insufficiency. She had not even touched the breadth and depth of practice, acknowledged fully her debt to the ancestors, to the mothers, to her teachers, disclosed to her students how great her love of them. How critical their thinking together intimately in the space of the seminar was like a hush harbor, a laboratory for her thought, like a good party without the awkwardness or the wine. But the intensity and possibility, the joy of gathering and assembly, her partners in crime, her allies, her co-conspirators, her brothers and sisters, her girls, set the terms for what she aimed to do, the place she endeavored to reach. This company required her to show up with everything she had to give because they had given so much, raised the stakes, produced the communal luxury that was Black studies, extended the mutual aid that made the thought of the outside possible, stoke the dreams and the plan for ending this world, for free association, for flesh against flesh. They plotted together. They had conversations that extended into the night. She was just one voice in the chorus that celebrated because they had to, that every day and every hour they mourned the death. They conspired against the plantation so that freedom and slavery and death and fungibility, nobody and nothingness would no longer be the coordinates of Black life. It was hard for her to articulate how full and deep the love of the work, how lucky she felt to be doing it, to be a guardian, a wailer, a fighter, a midwife, a custodian, a nurturer, an acolyte in and of this tradition, in and of this practice. Decades earlier, she had vowed never to lose sight of the work, never to be distracted by the business of it, the petty rivalries, the schools, the hierarchy, the administration, the protocols that deaden thought, never be embittered by the bullshit, the obstacles, the assault, and the fundamental disregard of this project, her project, our project. So she trained herself not to desire recognition, not need the praise of others to nurture the endeavor to endure in the context of controlled depletion. She knew the longings for recognition and affirmation had destroyed many Negroes, ruined so many minds. Okay, so this is where I was supposed to rewrite. I just wrote this during the break, so I had to catch up. Okay. She tried to live like a cactus and survive on so very little. So the feast was unexpected. The words she cobbled together could not even convey the joy, the enormity of endowment, the sense of disbelief as others described what she had done, what she had made possible. Had she achieved what they said? Was not more proof required to establish that she deserved it? Was the grand celebration a mistake or premature? Didn't she need to work even harder to prove she deserved it all? So she consulted the tattered outline of a plan for Black female genius, always at hand when she was writing, which was really just a how-to guide to survive in hostile conditions. Item number 4 stated clearly, want nothing, never care what they say about you. And now here she was at the podium, biting her lip and trying to hold back tears, to embrace it all, to find her place in this great company, to accept that she too had contributed something to this venture. But she started to choke up, so she just said, thank you, thank you.